Good evening and welcome to tonight's 2024 Budget Review City Council Work Session. I will start with, I guess I won't start, the City Manager will start with an introduction with both FY24 budget recap and responses and the FY24 budget resolution pro formas. We'll then review some of the dialogue that we had last Thursday and then go on to questions before public comment.
Thank you, Your Honor. Bringing up the slideshow now. So the mayor did a much better job than I would do of recapping the agenda. What I wanted to make sure we made clear to the council is that at the end of our recap and responses, which is a handful of slides, we plan to have the relevant department heads for whom there were questions at our all-day budget session come up and address the questions that pertain to their area. And I believe there are 6 areas. And then it would be great to hear from the council reps who want to recap how the public dialogue sessions went, and then we'll take it from there. So just a reminder of what we were working with from the outset in the beginning budget work session. To achieve a budget of no more than 4.5% over the current fiscal year, excluding the additional costs of the build-out related to the Information Technology Department. So here is a slide that summarizes the proposed operating budget, which is seeing an increase of 5.22%, which includes the 3 transfers to the special revenue accounts that you see here. The indoor pool coming off of being under the care of SIP. Actually decreases in the amount to Prescott Park, and an increase based on having a year under our belt relative to the care and maintenance of the community campus. In general government, that's where the bulk of the IT costs show up, along with some new positions and contractual obligations. And you'll see the collective bargaining contingency line, which captures the placeholder for police and fire and the paraeducators. This is the summary slide for the non-operating, which is down 2.59%, largely in the areas of property and liability and debt service and related expenses. A note here is that the Rockingham County tax line is level funded and estimated to be level funded from the current year. And as we know more about that, we can adjust that. And a reminder that in the capital outlay line, it is holding at 1.37%, where our policy dictates no more than 2%. And the capital outlay is an attempt to get back to previous to pandemic years of replenishment of capital items. The ARPA capital outlay slide helps to lay out the thought process behind the deliberate and thoughtful use of the American Rescue Plan Act for ARPA funds that remain available to the city. As voted on in March as part of the adoption of the CIP, there was support for a total of $155,000 to support cardiac monitors and half of the library courtyard replacement project. And in the book that was published, you will see that the items we include for recommended use of ARPA, because we know they would be eligible, would be under the fire department's personal protective clothing replacement, fully funding at the full amount, the library courtyard project, and as done in years past, the citywide storm drainage improvements line, which brings the total combined for capital outlay to $455,000 using ARPA. And then in a separate line item in the non-operating budget would be the use of ARPA funds in IT upgrades and replacements. We've identified that these also would be eligible for ARPA, and we would recommend, and these numbers come out after the printing of the budget, an additional $304,000 in ARPA, totaling $759,000 through this budget, which approximate roughly 11 cents on the tax rate. So the summary slide, and then I'll turn it over to Judy, is that coming in at a total of an increase of 3.67%, the FY24 budget comes in less than the rate of inflation and less than the council directive, and inclusive of the build-out of our IT department. So I'll turn it over to Judy next.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I just want to spend a little bit of time on unassigned fund balance. And we've seen this chart before. The unassigned fund balance is one of 5 components of total fund balance. And the unassigned fund balance can actually be looked at as a residual net resource. So this is similar to a savings account. It is not designated for any specific purpose. And it's also important to maintain a certain level of fund balance so that you have the resources in case of an emergency or a disaster. The prescribed level is really determined by the governing body, and it also is determined by your geographic location. So some municipalities across the country, if you live in an area where there's more flooding or tornadoes or hurricanes, the governing body might prescribe a higher level than what we have here in Portsmouth. So a fund balance ordinance was created long ago, but it was amended to increase these levels for Portsmouth in February of 2013. And what it says is to maintain an unassigned fund balance between 10 and 17% of the general fund appropriations. So if we look at this chart, you can see that we've maintained, I feel, a pretty healthy fund balance. It's actually looked at very favorable by our rating agencies. We're consistent, which is good. It goes up and down a little bit, but we're maintaining just under 14%. So we haven't hit our 17%, but this is still adequate. Now, the use of fund balance is really on a budgetary basis. So, in other words, the city will either, during the budget process, use fund balance, or after the budget's passed, through a supplemental appropriation. So really, in simple terms, the budgetary surplus from this chart, this is the use of fund balance, but we had a budgetary surplus from FY17 through FY22 between revenues and expenditures, about $29.7 million. However, during that same time period, the city utilized $22.6 million of fund balance to offset taxes. In FY22 alone, the city had a budgetary surplus for both expenditures and revenues together, about $6.6 million, but utilized $5,696,000 of fund balance. The city used $3,450,000 of fund balance during FY23, and we're proposing to use a little over $4.4 million in FY24. So this is a total of $30 million over 8 years, and an average of $3.8 million per year. So then the other component of establishing the tax rate is your revenues. And so here are the estimated revenues. We've gone over this before in a work session, but just to recap, revenues this year overall is showing a decrease of $2.7 million. And most of that net change is primarily due to the state revenue losses. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But we also had some net increases in other revenues to about $1.6 million. So that net decrease is $2.7 million. So when we talk about the one-time revenues, so this was something that was granted to us by the state of New Hampshire through the Adequate Education Grant, and also a kind of reimbursement from the New Hampshire retirement system. Again, one time. We budgeted, we received $624,000 in that area. Now, when I went and set the tax rate during this period, we had to use this money to offset taxes. This was the intent to be used through the calculation of establishing each community's tax rate. So we had to use this as a one-time revenue. At the time that the budget was adopted, the estimated tax rate was $15.30. But when we went to set the tax rate, there were some major changes. Some distribution for meals and rooms tax was increased. The county tax came down lower than we expected. So we were able to drop that rate by 10 cents to come to $15.20, or a 17-cent increase over FY22. So with the budget as presented, which is a 3.67% increase over FY23, the estimated revenues in city valuation as we see today, The estimated tax rate would be $16.13 per thousand of valuation. This represents 93-cent increase or 6.13% over the current rate of $15.20. Now for the median single-family home valued at $480,100, this equates to an annual increase of $447 or a monthly increase of $37. Now, just a reminder again that the final tax rate will be set by the Department of Revenue in the fall. And again, if we have significant changes in state revenues or the county tax, which we do not know at this time, and total local valuation, this rate could change.
Thank you. So at this time, and as mentioned at the outset, we thought it would be the best use of time to have you hear from the department heads for whom there were either lingering questions or requests that needed some follow-up, and we plan to take them in the order that they came up at last Monday's budget session. And if it works for the council, we could bring up Peter and Ben. We could pause after Peter and Ben for any questions, and then we'd go on to Todd and so forth. So there are a total of 6 departments you'll be hearing from, and first up would be Peter to address everything except for parking, at which point he'll bring Ben up. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Karen. Mr. Mayor, City Council, my name is Peter Rice. I'm the Director of Public Works. The question related to synergies or efficiencies of having a joint operation where the DPW takes over custodial staff or facilities management at the schools has been reviewed in the past. In 2010, former Mayor Farini created a Blue Ribbon Committee to look at interdepartmental efficiencies, and a number of items were identified. And the review of custodial functions was a big part of that. We also did a 2015 review to brush off, to see if any demographic changes, anything had occurred that would make it make sense, to see if there was additional or any potential opportunities. And we identified a number of things that we were able to consolidate and improve on. They did not include custodial staff. The main reason behind that is the custodial functions in the school system are pretty different than the custodial functions in our other buildings. The custodians are really embedded in the school culture and in the community, and as such, they're very important. And you don't really, if you're looking at efficiencies and reduction in staff, we were not able to identify reductions in staff as a result of that kind of synergy. It's my opinion that both the school department and the Public Works Department run a very lean facilities group, and if anything, I would make the argument that we could benefit from adding additional staff. As you know, we've been addressing a number of facilities that have suffered from some benign neglect, and we're catching up on some deferred maintenance, and it's not something that I would recommend looking for efficiencies or reduction in staff relative to creating a joint group. That does not mean there isn't value in stepping back and seeing if there are opportunities, and that's something that, as you've seen by the 2010, 2015, and recently when we took on the new ball field, we met with school staff and looked to see if it made sense in terms of purchasing specific equipment, and we do share some equipment, but things that we were able to see some synergies with, small engine repair. So we maintain all their mowers and small engine equipment, making sure we look at providing them services relative to some engineering support when appropriate. There was additional consolidation or some synergy that the finance department participated in and took over some of the roles that were previously separate. The school department moving to City Hall was one of the synergies that was identified. By being here, it gave the ability to work together more easily from a finance standpoint and an HR standpoint. So these are some of the things that we had looked at previously, but at this time, we would not recommend looking for additional efficiencies on the custodial side. However, looking forward in the future, there's always opportunities to try to do better and try to leverage our resources whenever we can. The negotiated utilities citywide, this is, I'm not 100% sure what the direction of this question was, but I took it as being, was there opportunity to make any improvements relative to how we negotiate utility purchases? And currently, we've been working with a buyer's agent, and they put together bids for us, and we have consolidated all the departments, school, fire, police, and all the general government departments under the same purchasing approach. So Roberta Orsini, our operations manager, is point on that, and we've worked very hard with our buyer's agent. It's not a broker, it's they provide our service, and what they do is they put together a list of, they bid the services and then make recommendations relative to the reliability of the service, because there's a lot of folks that you can buy power from, but they're not all AAA rated, they're not all necessarily reliable. So we make sure we focus our bids on those folks that are, we're going to get reliable service, and we're going to maintain and not be left in the lurch, which actually happened about 10 years ago when I first took over. We were stuck when a supplier backed out and left us on the open market for a couple of months. So, it's important. Energy costs are something that we're very cognizant of. This year was a new contract for us. It's a 2-year contract, and we did this intentionally. We know that community power aggregate purchasing is moving forward. At the time we put this budget together, it had not stood up. It is still in the process of being stood up. But we felt that it would be prudent to allow some time to get some experience so that we can look at the energy procurements that are being made, their track record, and whether it's appropriate for the city to be utilizing that service as well. So that's something we look forward to. I know we're looking to stand up that in June. That's very exciting for residents, and we look forward to continue to explore that as well. And then finally, the annual Prescott Park operation costs and anticipated upgrades. When we look at operating costs, or when we look at costs associated with operating a facility such as Prescott Park, you look at two components. One is the operational aspects, and then the other is the debt service associated with that. Debt service technically doesn't show up in the Prescott Park portion of the budget. It's a general fund and shows up in the general fund portion of the budget book. But if you think about it in terms of, yes, it is, but it's the projects you do at Prescott Park do have an overall impact. So you need, if you view it that way, it's a more total view of these projected upgrades. As you probably realize, there were about $6 million of upgrades identified. That did not include the arts building addition that we were looking at for the Shaw building. If you recall, during the capital improvements plan process, the council directed us to step back and to look at what the full project would cost. And based on our preliminary numbers, it's an additional $4 million for that addition. So we're looking at roughly a $10 million investment over 20 years at 5%, which is what we're assuming. We're roughly looking at a $1 million first year interest and principal payment. So that more than doubles the operating costs associated with Prescott Park. So it is a significant investment, and I believe there's opportunities to really revisit those things as we move forward. I think the council has expressed interest in looking at these investments, and we as a staff are here to support you and provide that information as best we can. So with that, I believe you would like to go to Ben, or would you?
Why don't we have Ben, and then if it makes sense, questions for both of you before we move on? Thanks, Peter.
Good evening, everyone, Mr. Mayor, Council. The questions that I received, the first one was about the $160,000 collective bargaining contingency in the parking budget. This was for contract negotiations for FY23, and by my records is a negative variance for this current year. Just an example of something, if we aren't going to need it, then we don't put it in the next year's budget. The next one was regarding the duties of the administrative position for High Hanover accounts. This is more of a nomenclature issue. This lady has worked with us for a number of years in the collections office. She now works as our lead cashier at Hanover, but she does perform a bunch of additional duties, including reconciling incident funds, dealing with the Loomis pickups on a daily basis, scheduling repairs and routing maintenance requests and complaints to appropriate supervisors, paying money. She does daily space counts and troubleshoots equipment malfunctions, things like that. So that is a little bit by way of explanation of what additional things that position offers for where she's at. The last one was what is the line for engineering costs going up from 279 to 402. This is an increase of 122,577. 75,000 of this is for the current 2023 parking study that's underway that we went ahead and put in professional services in engineering because it made the most sense. 26,000 of that is for two anticipated RRFB, the rapid reflective flashing beacon crosswalk situations that are popular and are requested often, so we figure we might end up purchasing up to 2 of those next year. And 19,000 of that is salaries, where with your 3% COLA, and then Eric Eby was on longevity, was moved up a step. And when we hired Tyler Reese, we talked to him about the possibility of doing more than just parking engineering types of things, so he could kind of branch out in his career and look where he might want to go, whether it was with the city or elsewhere. And he's more than outperformed the parking aspect of it. He's on several groups right now. And so we felt like an upgrade in his position and his title and his responsibilities was warranted. I think that is it.
Did you touch on end-of-year revenue?
Pardon?
I don't think you touched on end-of-year revenue projection.
The revenue projection, I think we were at, I don't know where the question was there.
What do you project end of
End of
this
year,
current
end of
fiscal
year this year. Yes, ma'am, sorry. I did not hear you well. So through April, which is period 10, we're at 8.2 million, which is 23% ahead of budget, which is about $1.5 million. So the average month through period 10 is 826,447. If you use those 2 months to finish out the year, we're looking at 9.9 million against what we had budgeted. Yeah.
So, Mayor, if it's appropriate, we thought we'd pause here, ask if there are any questions of the material of Ben or Peter.
Questions from the council? Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just a quick question for Peter. If I understand correctly, the Prescott Park, if we were to go forward with capital improvements, we'd be looking at the park costing roughly in the neighborhood of somewhere between $1 and $2 million a year.
About 1.68 would probably be, within, I think, FY26.
Okay, thank you.
But that's if you, obviously the debt portion of it's not shown in the Prescott Park budget.
Right. No, I appreciate, that's exactly the question I was looking for, though. So thank you very much.
Any other questions, both Peter and Ben?
And certainly staff will stick around if there are questions at the end. If not, we'll ask Todd to come on up. Todd was asked questions relative to the operational costs relating to the pools and is going to give a recap on fees that went through fee committee this year.
Yes. Good evening, Mayor, City Council. Todd Henley, Recreation Director. So the first question is in regards to the indoor and outdoor pool operating costs. The combined recreation and DPW operational costs for the indoor pool for FY23 are projected to be approximately $503,563. FY24 is looking slightly higher due to the increase in hourly wages and an additional full-time lifeguard. Revenues for FY23 should be around $532,000. However, we can get more revenue if we are able to open the pool more and add more programs and rentals. As for the outdoor pool, again, the combined recreation and DPW operational budgets costs for FY23 are projected to be $205,270. FY24 is slightly higher due to, again, an increase in hourly wages for our lifeguards. Revenue should be about $42,000 this year based on going up on the resident swimming lesson fees to a whopping $5 and increasing our entrance fees. As for the fees and other revenue ideas, excuse me, I have implemented a process of evaluating our fees, and we have made adjustments to almost all of our fees over the last 2 years, including indoor pool memberships, outdoor pool fees, like I just mentioned, Spinnaker Point membership fees, and room rentals, as well as boat launch fees. As for the community campus operational costs, we just completed our first full year in the building, and we've gotten a much better understanding of the costs involved. We have increased the amount of programs and hours of operation in the building. When we took over the building, the foundation only had it open 5 days a week with no evening hours. We are now open into the evening, during the weekdays, and then we're open on the weekends as well. So that reflects some of those costs. The food service historical information that we also received was based on a COVID restricted schedule, and between between getting the kitchen and cafe back to pre-COVID levels and new state guidelines that some tenants are restricted by with the food service, we had to adjust that cost to continue to provide that service. One other note is for the snow removal, that existing contract was ending, and so that had to be rebid out by DPW, and the number shown reflects what that bid came in as.
Thanks, Todd. Happy to answer any questions.
Councilor Bagley.
Thanks, Your Honor. Todd, you mentioned that the community campus is now open evening hours. You also alluded to weekends. Is it open at all on the weekends, or is it still closed?
No, it's still, we are open Saturdays from 8 to 4
Great, thank you.
and until 8 p.m. on the weekdays.
Councilor Boyack and then Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Todd. I understand the fees have been updated. Are there still ways for people that maybe couldn't afford those fees to get some help with those, or?
No, absolutely. We do. We actually partnered with the Are You In program, which is a Seacoast area nonprofit, and what they do is they basically to give people a much more less public way, a private way to. They go through this organization through the website, and they help qualify people for whether or not they should qualify for assistance from our programs. There's a lot of departments and different businesses that use this in the area. And then they basically get qualified for a year, and all they have to do is just show their Are You In card. And then we provide either reduced or free fees for them for almost all of our programs.
Awesome. Thank you.
Councilor Davis.
So, Todd, what is the, it sounds like the revenue for the indoor pool from fees is just about covering costs? Would you say that's where we are?
Yes, and we just increased that this past fiscal year, so we'll revisit that again to make sure that we're still meeting up.
Right, so we couldn't really justify any increase in fees if we're covering our costs.
At this point, no.
Councilor Morell.
You quickly mentioned that you could bring in more revenue if you could be open more hours. So have you, I know that you budgeted for more lifeguards at the indoor pool. Could you just expand on, are you looking at possibly wanting to have more hours, or are you talking because we now can be open more, the revenues will go?
Going back to pre-COVID hours, so even open on all day on Saturday, Sunday, we weren't necessarily open to the public on some of those or all those hours, but we were able to rent out the pool during a lot of those hours, which is one of our biggest revenue makers. So it's just more of being able to, because currently right now, there are certain days where we're closed for 2 to 3 hours in the middle of the day just because of lack of coverage. So to be able to, have coverage during that time to continue to offer programs during that time and then expand our rentals.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. And just to kind of follow up on Councilor Tabor's question, and it's probably similar to the question I asked about Prescott Park. When we talk about the revenue and the costs of the indoor pool, does that contain capital improvements or a contingency fund for upgrades that would be needed in the future, or However, I know we've done some pretty extensive upgrades to that pool in recent years. Are those funded through the fees, or is it only operating costs that are funded through the fees?
So it's just the operating costs. We do have a new CIP project item for the capital projects. Everything that was done prior to this was all done through SIP and covered through SIP so they fundraised and provided all the funding for the capital projects for those.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
I guess, Todd, I got one question. Oh, Councilor Cook, sorry, I didn't see it.
Thank you, Your Honor. I just have a question around the addition of an additional recreation supervisor. Are we going to see an increase in programming and therefore increase in revenues coming in association with adding that position?
We would like to see that, yes. So one of the main things that we'd like to have that position do is create an after-school program at the campus. So what we do right now is we have after-school classes where the kids get bused over there, but we're looking to actually put together like a full-time Monday through Friday after-school program, which would, of course, have fees included for to be able to attend that. So yes, I would say that it would coincide with an increase in revenues. Yes.
Thank you.
Todd, just a quick question on the full-time lifeguard. So we'll still have part-time positions. That's clear in
Yes.
in this? How? I guess from the in FY22 where the pool was still closed in FY22 for
Correct.
a portion of that.
We opened in November of that year.
Okay, so last year at 244,000, that was a more normal year, I guess, for part-time. I guess we're dropping that expectation down to 230,000, so 15,000 less. Is that I guess, would we expect with adding an additional full-time staff member at around 50,000, why would we only see a $15,000 savings on the part-time employees?
Sure. That's mostly due to that we're trying to increase all the hourly wages for the current existing part-time staff. So we're proposing like a $2 increase in their hourly wage to get them up to what is the Seacoast sort of standard for aquatics facilities.
Okay. And then and I understand and appreciate Councilor Tabor's desire to run this as a revenue neutral opportunity for those in Portsmouth. Do we know how much revenue we lost last year due to pool not being able to be open? Do we have an idea of that? And is that idea reflected in the budget? Meaning a number that we would look at from because we were closed X amount of hours, we can justify we lost X amount of revenue.
Sure. Just doing some quick math here on what I have in front of me, I'd say roughly, because we're putting into FY24 what we want to see, so everything full hours, so roughly $40,000.
Okay. All right. And then I guess because the full-time employee is going to be 50 plus benefits, it might be justified to look at fees if fees need to increase based on we don't exactly expect with the full-time employee to be able to make up the money from staying open longer. And if all of the employees are going up on the average in order to remain competitive with other pools in the Seacoast, I'd strongly consider looking at those fees if they can be included or increased to account just to make sure it continues to break even.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks, Todd.
Great. Next up is our Chief Information Officer, Pat Ainsworth.
I had several questions that I wanted to expand on in my responses. One question was, can we expect that after a few years, the IT budget will decrease? Last year, the deputy city manager represented that outside professional services would decrease once the city's new IT department was fully staffed. That was correct to the extent that she was referring to the expenditure of approximately $25,000 a month for a managed service provider to handle the city's day-to-day help desk and routine IT tasks. It did not include any work to advance our infrastructure or our applications. The contract with the city's managed service provider is winding down at the end of June, with very limited payments remaining until January 2024, specifically for an existing license for our backup and recovery infrastructure that we're committed to pay. The line item in the current budget for professional services is for a different set of professional services. They are focused on strengthening the security and resiliency of the IT infrastructure and applications. Those professional services will also be leveraged to initiate long overdue projects in support of the city's departments and the public. In the future, elements of this line item may better be captured under the distinct line items in the CIP or elsewhere in the budget. When I arrived in the fall of 2022, it took time to understand the existing infrastructure and the needs of the city. At that time, the CIP process was already well underway. When we enter the FY 2025 SIP and budget process, I will reevaluate the current structure of how IT describes and requests funding. Though the total budget request will likely increase each year, the rate of increase will certainly not continue. We are catching up to a normal funding amount that is required for success. Secondly, a request for a more detailed breakdown of costs, particularly specific items that we think can be reduced. For example, the elimination of Zoom. Items that will be reduced or eliminated will be, for the most part, replaced by more robust, high-functioning solutions. One cost will go away while another one is added. In the case of Zoom specifically, there is still a need to have some licenses, but the number will be greatly reduced, cutting the cost for that particular item significantly. This is because of the implementation of Office 365. IT is currently focused on security and resiliency projects and the backlog of application projects. In FY24, we will turn our attention to the future, working with departments to identify and prioritize the next round of projects. The volume and continuing nature of such work is the reason a project manager position is required. There was also questions about training and its impact on security specifically. We have an online cybersecurity training program, which is called CyberHoot, that all employees participate in. But that system has limitations. We are replacing it with a new system called KnowBe4 by Microsoft, and all employees will participate on a regular basis. This new system will allow us to see who actually watched the video, who took the quizzes, and what their score was. It will also allow us to customize the content more tightly to fit our environment. In addition, an executive-level cyber incident response tabletop drill will be conducted soon. This is training. Live training from Primex will be delivered on July 18 to the managers one level below that executive team. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency will conduct a security assessment of our environment and recommend remediations and improvements. This in itself will launch a portfolio of new projects. Regarding consolidation of IT over the next 5 years, one of my goals for FY24 is to draft an IT strategic plan. This plan will be developed in collaboration with all decentralized IT staff, since it is a comprehensive IT plan for the city. The topics of consolidation, cost saving, and mutual support will be part of that plan. And finally, we have moved towards electronic means for document distribution, particularly for the council and commissions. Will we make more advances? We are right now searching for an appropriate system to improve the management and delivery of documents. Demos of this software are beginning this week. City of Portsmouth emails have been created for all of you, and when we give them out, we will want a tech with us to assist you setting up your multi-factor authentication. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Pat. Any questions here? Councilor Moreau.
If we were to delay any of the start times of new employees, how would that affect your plan?
Right now, I understand the proposal would be for both of those positions to begin a quarter of the way into the year. That's not a game changer for us. We can manage nicely. When the project manager comes on board, though, as these projects are identified, we'll be able to start them and finish them more quickly. So it'll accelerate that. Hiring an engineer, which is your level 2 technical person, will mitigate what we're doing now, which is do level 1 in-house and then outsource level 2 and level 3. The in-house engineer will help us keep more of that work in-house. It won't replace our outside consultants who have deep expertise, but both of those things will make everything run faster.
Pat, I have a question. On the, maybe walk through a little bit the difference between the project manager and the IT engineer. And I guess from the standpoint of, would expect there to be engineers both on the vendor side of folks that we're contracting with, as well as, potentially offshoring some of this from a IT engineering group. I guess I can understand, support having a project manager and understand that, with your role as the Chief Information Officer, you kind of have to have the vision for where the ship is going. Understanding having somebody dedicated from project management standpoint, but maybe, I guess, speak to me on why we can't have a project manager with more engineering background experience that could, take on some of the more, I guess, easy tasks, and have the engineer continued to be outsourced.
So let me start with the project manager. A project manager position is not a highly technical position. You have to be able to understand what's going on and understand the language that people are using. But their primary responsibility is to keep your project moving, make sure that the people that are going to use the technology are in the loop all the time, and to most importantly, meet your deadlines and watch your pennies. So this is all about being efficient as we roll out these projects. The position of engineer is a highly technical position. So right now, the simple things are done by our in-house techs, which we have 2 of. They're both highly talented. When we have the engineer, the next step on things that they can't handle will be right in-house. And there will be plenty of work for this person to do, not only responding to break-fix issues, but in the design of new things that we're trying to roll out. So it really is Tier 1, we already have. Tier 2, we're outsourcing now, but we'll bring in-house. And Tier 3, because of the skills that are required at Tier 3, that we could never afford to hire full-time, those will continue to be outsourced. Did I answer your question?
You did. I guess from a standpoint of the project manager, and I get, like engineering, like you wouldn't want a full-throated engineer being a project manager, because they will continue to build something until it's like, we do things, we choose to do things not, because they are easy, but because we thought they were going to be easy, a play on JFK's, because they're hard. I don't know if we couldn't find a recovering engineer that wanted to be in the more project management space and left that world, because you're still going to need somewhat of a technical background to understand just what the limits of a REST API are, when we're talking about connecting systems, and to be able to have that interface with other I guess business owners or department heads would seem to be like, you want to be able to set the expectation when it comes to some of that. So, I can understand the project manager as we want to do things, certainly more than what we are already doing is going to require somebody to prioritize, some of those opportunities. But I would be worried if we said that we need a Project 2 engineer, because eventually we could make that same argument would be a Project 3 engineer, and we're doing more in-house. So we recognize that there is a difference, and that that there are going to be, outsourcing some of this. And I would like to make sure that we, if it's more money for a more skilled project manager with some of that background, I would rather spend it there than to go down employing engineers, from our standpoint at the moment.
The engineer that we're contemplating hiring is not going to be designing stuff from scratch. It's not the common use of the word engineering. It's the person that has deep technical expertise to fix things, to be part of the team when we're building things. And that expertise is at a very high level for an in-house person. So the two jobs are entirely different. The project manager is going to be running these projects, and right now I'm doing that. Having a project manager will in part enable me to start to look to the future, do information security, write strategic plans, think about the budget, and instead all these projects land on my desk. And so I have to manage the projects, watch the budget, keep people rolling, but it will help you get more value out of the CIO position if there's somebody running with all these projects. And again, the engineer, totally different skill set. So finding somebody that was both a project manager, skilled, and an engineer would be next to impossible, I think.
Well, you certainly, you've sold me on the need for a project manager, and I think getting that out of your wheelhouse so that you're able to focus on some of the requests and prioritizing them amongst the different department heads is certainly, understand that. I guess I would worry from going back to a less technical project manager than yourself. We would run, potentially have a risk of having, us building something a little bit and not recognizing if you have a project manager without the engineering know-how and skills, it could potentially allow the project, in the planning stages to get out of scope, and find out that what we're looking to build is much less modestly priced and might not be the priority that we have with the limited resources. But
Yeah, I get your point. The project manager must understand technology at a basic level. The engineer has to be so skilled that if something's broken, they actually know where to look, know how to fix it, and get us back online. So that would be the difference. And, and the engineer will directly impact the outsourced services. Because right now, the things that engineer can do, we are outsourcing to consultants.
Thank you, Pat. I think see more questions. Assistant Mayor.
Thank you.
Councilmember.
Thank you, Pat. To touch on what you just said, do we know what essentially the rate of return would be to bring this position in-house for the decrease of outsourced funding?
No, I can't estimate that right now because it depends on the projects that we kick off. So how much work can we now keep in-house as opposed to sending on the outside? I can't, because I'm not in a forward-facing position right now, I can't even tell you what projects we're going to do in FY '24. Right now, we're pulling out all the things people have been waiting for. Well, we started with security. The infrastructure had weaknesses that needed to be immediately mitigated, so we've done a lot of that. Then we pulled out the projects that people have been waiting for a long time. The next step is going to be for me to meet with department heads and say, where are your pain points? Where could you use some help? And those will become additional projects for the future.
One of the things I asked, and I don't think it made it on to here directly, is I was looking to get a breakdown for what we spend for outside IT support, a more detailed breakdown of essentially for me a flow chart for us non-tech savvy people of where I'd like to see, like in detail, how much we are outsourcing. That would be, I know we can't get an exact number, but directly to say tier 2 engineers and tier 3 engineers. So look for more of a breakdown for the line item of 540,440. So if that's possible, if we could get it through the city manager, that would be great.
I'll work on that.
Thank you.
Councilor Moreau, and Councilor Tabor, and Councilor Bagley, and Councilor.
If we were to hold off on doing the IT engineer in this fiscal year, how much would that change or affect the budget based off of then continuing to outsource it for a year?
That's what's hard for me to predict, because I don't know how much work we're going to be doing and how much the engineer would be able to pick up. Each individual project has different levels of complexity from a technology perspective. Some of the projects are so straightforward that the internal team is running with them now. Other projects are so complex and challenging that they're almost entirely done by experts on the outside. So the nature of the projects that we surface in FY '24 would determine that mix. I think going forward, it will be much easier for the CIO to present, these are the priorities for the next year, here's the breakdowns of what it's going to cost and what those costs will be. But right now, in the position we're in, there was no time yet to look forward. So FY '24, I know we have a bucket of stuff that needs to be done, but prioritizing what we will do in FY '24 is before us.
We had Councilor Tabor, then Councilor Bagley, and Councilor Cook.
Thanks, Mayor. Pat, I wrote down a quote from when we were at the library, and you said, "A steady stream of projects must be the norm."
Mm-hmm.
And I admire your ambition to get there. But the IT upgrade this year is a $690,000 increase. I think my question is, are we going too fast? Could we slow it down? And regardless of budget, which is a big consideration, should we slow it down? I mean, there's a certain taking hold process that happens with any executive and any team. So to Councilor Moreau's point, it would be beneficial to the budget to slow down the hiring. And I just want to get a sense from you of, are you confident moving at the speed that you envision towards a steady stream of projects? Or should we maybe pace this out over 24 months?
we are capable of moving this fast over the long term. IT is normally a fire drill, and part of that is projects. So, for example, we just replaced both of our firewalls. We only had one, it was very old. Now we have two that work redundantly. The life expectancy for those firewalls is 5 years. So at some point, 4 or 5 years out, we will have to do that project. So many of these projects are iterative. It's not one and done, so they're constant. And we ended up in the position we're in because our managed service provider essentially did break fix. If it was broken, they would get it running. But nobody was looking at what should we be looking at that's new so that we could provide better service. The things that I see on my plate right now, I would think you would not want slowed down, particularly all the security projects, the infrastructure, so that everything's rock solid. But even the applications, there are employees at the city who could so benefit by having some technology. Eliminate the paper, keep better track of what's actually going on in their departments. I would not recommend that you step back from creating those efficiencies when that's what you've got in front of you. The opportunities are huge.
Great. And let's flip it around and talk about opportunities then. I think you are right. You said that the new financial system, enterprise software around, starting in finance and integrating into that is a huge opportunity. I like to think, I make it up in my head that there'll be more self-service for residents. So maybe talk about, this is going to cost, $49 for the average household next year. What's in it for our residents?
And I don't know that we'll be able to kick off that project next year. The process of even doing the RFP and determining what are your business needs so that you end up with a system that addresses what you really want done, that's an extended process. We will start it next year. I don't know if we'll finish it. And then we select the vendor. At that point, the project really kicks off. I don't see that happening in 2024, but it's possible. The benefit to the citizens and to the council is that your financial data will be more accessible, that the reporting can be cut in many different ways. It will save labor in the finance department. For the citizens, there will be more, as you said, online opportunities to do business with the city that will be fast and professional.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Councilor Bagley and Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I'll be forthright that, information technology and security and all of that is not a strong point of mine. So the technical details of everything, I really can't speak to whether they make sense or not. But when I look at this from 30,000 feet, in fiscal year 22, we had one employee and a budget of 762,000. In 24, we're looking at 8 employees and a budget of roughly 1.9 million. And my concern is that we may be going from an old pickup truck with roll-up windows and no radio, to the latest Cadillac. And I would say that as, desirable as it is to be able to do things quickly and online with the city, I think if we took a slower approach and left some money in residents' pockets, that might be preferable. And one of the examples you brought up kind of highlights that. Is you mentioned city council emails through the city. When I decided to run for council, I signed up for a free Gmail account. It didn't take any effort on the city's IT department's behalf because it's just my account. There's no cost to it. By rolling into city emails, we're now generating not only the cost of all the email addresses, but the IT time to teach us. So just using that as one tiny line item, of which I'm sure there's lots, I'd like to see us look for ways to economize if we can. And the other thing that I'm hearing is we're going to probably see substantial increases in the budget in the future years as these types of projects that are just starting to take shape take off, and I'm not entirely sure the city can afford that approach.
Regarding the emails, first of all, our in-house team created your emails in probably 4 minutes. Very easy process for the in-house team to do, so there's not a lot of expense associated with that. And having one of them here to help you with your multi-factor authentication, it's nearly a zero-cost situation. So that particular example doesn't save us any money and will be beneficial because now city business will be done on the city's email. And if there's issues and you have to do discovery, we won't be going into your personal email to get the information we need. So keeping that separate is important. But that's almost a no-cost effort once we have the email system set up, and we already do. I lost track of the second half of
You know what I might do? I might ask, if I may, Your Honor, Deputy City Manager Woodland to come up. She was helping with the transition. She can speak to what other communities have for long-range plans relative to IT and can speak to the downtime associated with the not taking on some of this work.
Yeah, so I just want to remind you of some history, because I know there's a big ask here. Trust me, I get it. Your questions are all fair. What I want to, because I really lived really what happened about 1.5 years ago, a few days after our mayor and the city council were sworn in, where our system went down for 3 days, down. And little bits and pieces over the course of weeks came online. We paid a chunk of money far and above our regular monthly $25,000 fee to get ourselves back. And the reason that happened is because we underinvested for years. And that underinvestment really kind of fell apart or didn't happen because there was no one who really understood and could look strategically and sort of holistically at the whole network and all the connections and the switches and what happens if there's a failure here and a failure there. You know, we don't just do one thing, one product. We've got a broad, scope of services. And it doesn't look like a lot of other commercial entities. So it really does require, from an engineering and networking perspective, a team that understands how to deliver what we need from a municipal perspective in terms of security from the SCADA side to our finances. I guarantee you there's almost no way without an engineer in-house that we are going to be successfully able to deliver a new financial software package. Because the current bits and pieces within the network for finance, because there are a bunch of little small programs, old programs, that is just going to take a lot of work and a lot of forethought. And if we're going to get there, we're going to need the engineering horsepower to do it, and you want to do it in-house. So I was responsible before Pat got here, working with our outside consultant, who is the guy who does all the much of the Primex training on security. He and I looked at how do we get to Microsoft 365 in the cloud, because we are about ready to have our email systems crash. And in fact, parts of them have crashed over the course of the last 2 years, what we've been trying to get in the cloud. And when we negotiated that systems engineering contract to move us to the cloud, we had to build in a really big number because we didn't have the in-house sort of horsepower and wherewithal to do some of the work that we could have done in-house in terms of that working together. I mean, Pat can tell you, once we brought the help desk people on, it was great. We really then began to, move forward in the project with new speed, because we were dependent on that outside contractor in terms of the schedule of rolling this out and then in the cost. So those are the kind of things that when you're looking at least from my perspective, before Pat got here, and I was like, oh, we've got some major pieces that we need to look at. That's part of what we're dealing with. I am optimistic that as we get AI products, as we get the network better stood up, that we are going to see some efficiencies. I don't know exactly when, and I think that's the trouble Pat's having. We are so early in this process. I can tell you, and I think I mentioned last year, I looked at, the other communities like Concord and Dover and Rochester to see what their structure looked like within their IT departments. How many people did they have? What were they doing? And tried, and I think I forecasted last year that eventually we'd be looking at additional hires of an engineer and some, whether it's a project manager or someone else, because that's when you look at what other communities have of our size, delivery of our services, it's a pretty robust team. Now, I do think, as Pat said, when we start to do that strategic planning, Pat is committed to looking for opportunities given the school department, but of course they have their own network right now, and so, it's going to be a process. You've got the police department, they have all their special requirements because of their FBI, credentials, so to speak, to touch all the really secure stuff. So it's not easy to figure out how that's going to go, but we can look at it because there are probably some opportunities within, as we go down and look forward for some of those pieces. But I think that's why, Pat is kind of coming in still, 6 months you've been here? So she's still on the very much the learn curve. So I just wanted to give you some perspective from, kind of living the challenges of IT before Pat got here and speaking with a lot of communities, because I really was trying to get what you would need and what I would need, frankly, to feel comfortable saying, I think this is the path forward. So there's just kind of my take and a little bit of history.
Thanks, Suzanne. Kate, or Councilor Cook?
Thank you, Your Honor. That was really my question. I don't know if Suzanne wants to answer this or not, but my question was around redundancy. And once we do the strategic planning process and we look at across departments, are we confident that both these positions will not be ultimately redundant when we're looking at schools and police? And the reason I'm asking that is that I feel like whenever you add a position, they rarely go away, even if there is a redundancy. So I just want to make sure that we're not over hiring when we already have expertise elsewhere.
Yeah, I certainly know you well enough that I think that's a fair question, and I understand that concern. I don't know if I have a good answer to that, but I can say, having worked with a lot of other departments over the last 20 years, we certainly have let positions go or they morph into something else. And that is always going to happen within any department, and certainly would happen within IT. There may be at some point where maybe you have the smart AI, and so you don't need the help desk people, but you will need more engineers or more, something else, or maybe not at all, because maybe the help desk tasks get done. And I think we certainly see some possibility that, our help desk folks are smart and, maybe they get additional training. You also look at, frankly, the woman with the gray hair. You look at when are people likely retire. That always opens up opportunities. Do you keep that position? Do you rename that position? And what do you do? So I don't have a clear answer to that because we are early in the process, but it's a fair question. And certainly that's part of the plan, I think, to look at that as we go forward. So.
Councilor Lombardi.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your presentation.
Counselor, you're going to need to use the microphone. Kevin's going to yell at me.
I know that rolling out new software, especially software like accounting software, project management software, legal software, is a tremendous job, and it takes time. And you just alluded to that the accounting software is probably 2 years out before you start actually really using it, because not only do you have to train people in the software, you also have to double entry, basically. You have to keep your old software going while you're converting to the new software. I understand that. Each of these projects, how many can you do concurrently, I guess is what I'm saying. And so in one sense, I'm asking, do you slow that down a little bit? Because, you know, one project is going to take an immense amount of work from your engineer. You can't probably do 2 or more of them at the same time. Just rolling out Microsoft 365 is a big project. I'm just trying to figure out how much time the engineer will take, and at what time. And is the engineer necessary for the planning, or is the engineer necessary for the implementation? Where is that person most important? And if it's implementation is 2 years down the road, is that person someone we can hold off on half a year, 3/4 of a year, maybe a year? I don't know. So I guess that's my question.
The finance system will be by far the biggest project that IT does. It will be consuming for 2, if not 3 years. There will be so much work to be done that anything that you would give that engineer, if the engineer was absent, would have to go outside to professional services. But more than that, when this project kicks off, you're really going to want an engineer that understands our environment, so you need to get them on board earlier. Same thing with the project manager. The project manager will probably spend 50% of their time working on that finance implementation when it starts. The engineer will be close behind. The finance department itself doing process documentation and process re-engineering before you program the system is a huge task. One task is to rewrite the whole chart of accounts. That is a massive project in itself. What is it we want to count? You're going to want reports on, and rebuild that chart string so that you can get at that data. This project, I would expect, I've got the RFP a third written, and I need Judy's time to work with me to fill out the rest, to articulate our needs, but I'm hoping that the RFP will be out the door maybe in 3 months. Then we'll start to have vendors apply, we'll watch demos, have everybody in the finance department watch the demos so that we can make the choice. If we make the choice expeditiously, we could be signing a contract maybe a year from now, but then the project starts. And it will go for at least 2 years beyond the time you sign the contract. And at that point, which I hope is a year away, you will benefit greatly by having a project manager and an engineer who already know the environment before that kicks off. So having them on board now enables them to get ready for this mammoth project that's going to be a game changer. That's an example just with that one project. You're absolutely right that when that kicks off, you can already tell by the demands on those 2 people and on Cindy Chase, who is our applications director, is going to be huge. And during that time period, of that 2 years, all the other projects are going to have to be prioritized, and many of them are going to have to be held back. So for this year, we're getting as far and as fast as we can. A lot of the work that we're doing is building resiliency disaster recovery center, redundant systems that have multiple power supplies, get everything as rock solid as we can, so that when we kick off this finance project, we actually have resources that are available.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I guess just one question left from me. We have contracted services here at 540,000. If we didn't move forward with a IT engineer, what would we expect that number to move to?
That's a good question. That number would, the number that you have assumes that there would be an engineer. And that's how the budget was built. And putting it off for a quarter will mean work that engineer would have done is going to be outsourced.
So that number is off. These are 3-year hires. So if it's possible to understand, or fund 75% of the year, so it would be, and I can't imagine that this increase from last year is represented just in the 25% that we're losing this engineer, but that would be a good number to have back.
I can estimate that to the best of my ability, but
And you
again,
don't have to do that right here at the
yeah,
podium.
but my challenge is, if I don't know what projects we're going to line up for next year, I don't know which ones require the level 2 that we would then have to outsource it. So the math on that's challenging.
And I think that's the, my view on this is, I think that it's really clear that we need a project manager. You should not be the project manager in this, and I think that I would be probably a universal, I can't speak for all the council, but it seems like a reasonable thing to not have the CIO be the project manager. But when there are projects, to make sure that they're correctly prioritized. I think where at least I'm having trouble with the engineer, considering that we don't have one now, that we're contracting that out now. I would need a number of the savings that we would have. I would also want to know, in your position when you're not a project manager, what that would be. And then I think, I appreciate what the city of Dover does and the city of Concord, great cities in and of themselves. But when we were kind of late to the game in terms of investing in IT, but software is a leapfrog business. And so what works for the city of Concord or city of Dover, we might be able to avoid those mistakes. Especially, I don't want to bore people with AI, but, asking, a large language model to write some code for you, like, that's here already. And I guess I'd be concerned if we're going to invest in an engineer, and I'd rather spend the same salary for those both combined and get a much better project manager that has the engineering background, because we'll save on the health insurance, at least not doubling that up, and not making sure that we are investing our money and continue to outsource, because I do think, at least in the implementation and the services, the trend is towards moving those out, at least in the private sector, and I'll trust your expertise in the public sector, but I appreciate sitting up here and answering our questions, and I think the council is better for all of those answers, as well as Suzanne. Councilor Lombardi, one more.
Just one more question. I just, Suzanne's presentation, I watched Suzanne in the process of hiring you, and it was not an easy process. I saw her stressed with it. So part of the problem with being a municipality is that people can make a lot more money elsewhere. And so what's your best guess about when you could actually get someone in the door.
For the engineer position?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. These people are very hard to find. And the engineering we're looking for, we don't do any coding. We don't write any software. So what the engineer is mostly focused on is how the network itself works. So that's a network engineer, primarily. Being a network engineer requires that you stay technically up to date as the equipment evolves every 2 or 3 years. So you need deep skills behind you. This is going to be hard to find. The help desk people, easier to find. Project manager, easier to find because it's more generic. The engineer will be the tough one.
I guess that was my point.
Yep.
And it might take some time.
Yes, it might take many months to find a candidate that is both what I'm looking for and okay with working for the salaries we have to offer. Because these guys in the corporate world, we're talking $250,000. So it'll take a bit of time.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Zach McLaughlin from the school department. Zach has a number of items that he is going to report back on, and he will lead into the discussion about school resource officer with the PD.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and City Council. Zach McLaughlin, Superintendent of Schools. So several items to enhance from the conversation that we had in the library the other day. We'll start with a question around free breakfast and lunch and what would the costs be for the school district to provide those meals, similar to what we were doing during the COVID pandemic. I think there's two different elements that folks need to look at as we go through that. First is the direct costs of actually paying for those meals. And those direct costs combined with what we would lose in federal reimbursement for those meals, we think that about $2.9 million on an annual basis is what you'd be looking at in order to provide free breakfast and lunch to all students in the school district over the course of a year. There's also secondary costs connected with that, and one good example of that is Title I funding. So Title I is a program that was set up in order to help disadvantaged and struggling students in schools. It's a formula-driven grant right now on an annual. This last allocation for us was just south of $450,000, which we use on a variety of different things to assist those students. That formula for that grant, the primary thing it is pegged to is the number of free and reduced lunch students in your school district. Now, how this could become a secondary problem for us if we do provide the meals, which we would love to be able to do, is there's two ways in which people qualify for free and reduced lunch in the school district. One is through something called direct certification. Direct certification is a situation where you would be already participating in another federal program, let's say food stamps, and you would automatically qualify. You wouldn't have to apply. However, we have another chunk of people who end up qualifying for free and reduced lunch who apply. We have to look at what's going on with their finances and whether or not they would qualify for the program. Our concern is if we were to provide meals for all, the secondary cost would be you remove the incentive for families to apply for that federal designation because they're already receiving the benefit. So what we don't know, and we don't have a calculation for, is of that $430,000 that we received in the last year for Title I, which is reasonably consistent, what would the impact be if we were to provide those meals for all students? Again, I think as a school district, we understand that kids who are fed are going to learn better, but we're also trying to balance that cost against the rest of the things that we need to provide and do in a under a reasonable budget for the taxpayers. Second on this is positions and monetary costs. We talked the other day in the library about the positions. We spelled out the things that were inside of the local budget, but there was a question specifically around ESSER funding. So the elementary and secondary schools emergency relief funds that were part of COVID, and what has been going on over the last couple of years with positions. And just as a kind of a refresher from last year's work, There were several positions that were in ESSER this current operating year: an elementary outdoor education teacher, a social worker, a math interventionist at the high school. The school board last year had requested that also that a math tutor and a counselor, both at the middle school, were to be put into the local budget. And the council ultimately decided to push that back into ESSER. So we have currently in this operating year, there are 5 positions that are sitting in ESSER. And I think, as most of you know, this upcoming fiscal year is the end of our opportunity to utilize ESSER funds. So in this current the school board's process this time around, they wanted to take 4 of those positions and push it into the local budget this time around and leave 1 still in ESSER. Through conversation with the manager, ultimately we decided to pull out 2 more of those positions and put them into ESSER. So we had 3 positions. I think this is what we talked about the other day in the library. 3 positions that would remain in ESSER for the next fiscal year under this proposal. Social worker, who currently is housed at the middle school, but does some service across the school district. The math interventionist that I mentioned before, and then the outdoor ed position. So the question I think I had left in the last slide in our presentation from the other day was that we had some lingering questions, and one of those lingering questions was, what are we doing with those ESSER positions if we do what we're proposing here? What are we doing in the next cycle? So the question that I had was specifically how much will those 3 positions cost if we were to fund them through the local budget, and it's $430,000 total compensations, combination of benefits and salary. In addition to that, I also had a question around the number of resident students that we thought were going to private institutions. I talked a little bit about what we were seeing in terms of trends in enrollment in the school district over the last 10 years. The best data we can give you in relation to the private school question is connected to a contractor that we work with, we've worked with for quite a while, the New England School Development Council, NESDEC, who does enrollment estimations for us. So over the last 10 years, K-12 enrollment in the district is down 179 students across the system. I think the question was, to what extent can we look at some of that and see that maybe that's families are choosing private education, and that might be part of that decline in enrollment. What we see in the last 3 years is that that's not the case. It's pretty steady. So the numbers that we have from this group who do reach outs to those private institutions is the number of resident students over the last 3 years who have been in private schools were 220 3 years ago, 210 and 220. So we've been pretty steady even through this COVID period. On special education, we had discussed the fact that there was a decent sized increase that was pretty much connected to out of district placements for the most part. So 3 buckets that falls into. We had tuitions for out of district placements going up $360,000. That's connected to 2 elements. One is we have 3 additional students who are going to be sent to out of district programs. That brings us up to 17 total. And in addition, that 17, we're also seeing increases in costs for all of those placements as well. So in addition to that, we're seeing an increase in transportation costs for those out-of-district students. There are fewer and fewer companies who are doing that sort of transportation. We do not do it in-house. We're looking at a $50,000 increase in that transportation for those students. And then last on special education is also we're seeing growth in the number of students who are in charters who are requesting special ed services from the district. Now, typically, we do not. In some cases, some districts will will hire their own special educator and send them out to those locations to provide special education service. But there's very few people who actually do that. In our case, we actually provide funds to those institutions for them to hire folks themselves to do that work. And again, that's the tune in this budget, that's the tune of an additional $50,000. I had a question in relation to Robert J. Lister Academy and having a little bit more detail than what was in the binder. So first, Robert J. Lister is a special revenue. So it is funded through 3 different sources: a general fund transfer for the students that are residents of Portsmouth School Department, a set of tuitions for students that come in from SAU 50 and the surrounding communities, and then a separate tuition line for even communities who are not part of that. The structure at the moment of that program is it's actually targeted to be a 20 to 25 student program. The entire cost of running the program is $1.1 million. That's broken up. A lot of that is staffing, like most of our costs in the school district. So we've got 7.9 total FTEs that are connected with that program. One of those is an administrator, 5 are teachers, and then you have a combination of part-time positions that cover custodial, less than a half-time custodial person, less than a full-time clerical, and less than a full-time paraeducator, who are all connected with that program. And then the last question we had was around school resource officers. And what I can tell you, there's a request for some more information about costs. What I can just tell you is what I know we do now. So currently there is a school resource officer at the high school. That's never been a cost assumed by the school district. That's always been something that's been done through the department. When we added the middle school SRO, the school district picked up half of the salary of that SRO, which is about $56,000. In terms of what, if we were to add additional, I think there was some conversation about adding additional SROs. I would have to lean heavily on the police department for those figures. So I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Zach. Why don't we hold off on maybe some of the school resource officer questions, if there's any, for the police department, and you can come back up for that. But Assistant Mayor.
Thank you. I have a really simple question. With Lister Academy moving to community campus, could we look at consolidating some of those custodial needs?
I don't know what I'm looking at. Where am I going to go? I know. There we go, Nathan. Can you speak to custodial on that?
Or is that a position that kind of rotates within?
So right now, Lister Academy is served by a 38% custodian. The other 62% is at New Franklin Elementary. I think right now the plan has been that the custodians will continue to deliver service to that space. But I know that in the early stages of envisioning what would be happening in that space at community campus, it's been certainly not only custodial but food service have been things that we've talked about, finding some way to involve the schools in with the city. So it may be something that can be served through the contracts that the city has in place with the staff that the city has there. We're just now launching the notion of renovating the space, so we haven't yet talked about how to operate it, but I know that we'll continue to have those conversations. I thought I should also say, because I made note of it just a second ago, the budget of Lister, because it stands alone, not only includes all of the programmatic things you might expect that the superintendent just spoke to, but it also includes all the overhead, so electric and natural gas and custodial maintenance, all of that stuff is built in to that budget because it stands alone as a special revenue program.
Just a follow-up question. Would we assume that, like, once the school is stood up at the community campus, that some of those items would be funded through the general maintenance of the building, like the electric, like the gas, like those things? So I would assume that we'd actually see a budgetary decrease in that because we're already paying for those things.
I certainly appreciate the question. I think if you looked at the anticipated budget of the community campus special revenue, it's expecting that the dollars that right now the Lister program commits to the old Sherburne building will become part of the operating carrying cost to keep that building going. Right now, that space that we will occupy that Lister will occupy, there's not much being done with it. It's not using a lot, not generating the same level of cost that it will when it's fully functional and we have students and teachers there. So right now, what we've understood as the practice or as the plan is hold on to your electric and your gas and keep those things in that plan because it'll have to be contributed to the building's overall costs.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Bagley, Councilor Cook, Councilor Blaylock.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I guess I just have a question also regarding the Lister Academy. My understanding is the cost per pupil district-wide is somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 a year now. And the cost per pupil at Lister Academy, based on the numbers that were presented tonight, is substantially higher than that. And I also understand that we have a lot of students who tuition into Lister Academy. Are they tuitioning in at the roughly $20,000 number, or are they tuitioning in at a higher real number of what the cost is?
So it depends on what communities they're coming in from. So if you are outside, so let's start with furthest out. If you are outside of SAU 52 and 50, we're paying roughly $54,000 to tuition into that program. SAU 50 comes in at a lower rate than that. And then we, as I said before, we make a general fund transfer to pay for our own students who are part of the program. So it is a more, I'll just acknowledge up front, it is a more costly program because of the needs of that particular set of students. It's a program we're very proud of, obviously, as well. But if other communities are coming in, yeah, they're paying at that $54,000 rate. Outside of us and Greenland Newcastle Rye as well.
Okay, that's the answer I was looking for. Thank you.
Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I just have a question. It's a kind of a two-part question. The first, could you reiterate that number around declining enrollment this year?
So this is, I'll give you the exact, this is over the previous 10 years. Over the previous 10 years, 179 students. And there are projections for that, that rate to continue, if not possibly increase. But that's all based on, they're making estimations based on existing housing stock, births, all those types of things. But yes, 179 over the previous 10.
And now I know you haven't been here for those 10 years, but as we've lost 179 students, have we lost a commensurate number of educators?
And I don't have the history to be able to speak to what was what were the number of FTEs that were present 10 years ago versus the number of FTEs that are present today. But it's something we can definitely work on you for a future meeting.
That would be wonderful. I would love that if I could ask the city manager to see if we can get that data. Thank you.
So just a quick follow-up on the math, and apologies if I'm going to get strong, but 18 kids every year for the last 10 years, right? Through 12 grades, that's a kid and a half per class, if they were roughly spread out over each. So I would be surprised if we saw, that's a kid and a half per class each year. If we saw dramatic switches in the
and I would guess that you're probably accurate, because when we think about this in terms of student enrollment, we think about it as a stair step down, because there's almost never a direct in the moment correlation between the number of kids and exactly like a ratio to the number of FTEs, because you have to have, let's say, you need 20 kids in the same grade level at the same time to not be present in order to potentially eliminate a staff member. So those are, so there's not always going to be that direct correlation.
And this year, we are seeing a reduction in an elementary school teacher at Little Harbor. Guessing, maybe anecdotally, that's a more expensive neighborhood, and more of the families, it's tougher to move in to Little Harbor, and there's more space than there was 10 years ago.
I think that's the pattern we're seeing, is that the growth, where we're seeing growth is particularly at Dondero. And then, so it starts with Dondero, and then, but Little Harbor is a place, I think, because of those price points for families, you're seeing the decline most rapidly in Little Harbor. And the school board, we did not redraw the lines this time around. They did look at that as a possibility in the fall for this upcoming FY. But what they did do is, when two new housing projects came online, one was the condos at the bottom of Kate, and then the project out at Beverly Hill. Those were both designated for Little Harbor. because of what we were seeing in terms of what's happening at each of those schools.
Okay, and I would assume that any redistricting effort, which is a painful thing for everybody to go through, and just, I think hopefully it would be less so now because all of our elementary schools are fantastic, but your older brother goes to a school or you went to a school, I could see where, obviously I live close enough to New Franklin that it would be tough to get redistricted out of there, but I could appreciate that. Is there ever, and I guess I would hope that there would be a way that if we didn't, this is the impact on the teachers and the budget based on not redistricting at this time. Like, we could save money by consolidating here, and that just be a part of the calculation that we're all aware of and take into account when redistricting is not chosen. In terms of cost savings, like this year, if we could have saved money by redistricting in terms of better filling the classrooms that we have, lowering classroom sizes, just would love that to be a part of the conversation. But again, that's all your bailiwick, and happy for it. Councilor Blaylock.
Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Zach, for getting us all these numbers. I am glad to see that the number of resident students that attend private schools hasn't changed dramatically. I would hate to see that. I would never want people to not want to choose the Portsmouth school system. And those numbers, I just want to clarify, those include St. Philip's Exeter, St. Thomas, Waldorf, St. Pat's, Portsmouth Christian Academy. I mean,
That's my understanding. Again, we go through a third-party vendor who then
right.
reaches out to those institutions.
I just want to make sure they include elementary, middle school, and high school. Thank you. And then just to touch on the redistricting. So if there was an influx of children, say tomorrow, if we had to redistrict, is it correct, you would be looking to redistrict to put more students at Little Harbor?
Yeah, I think there's layers to this conversation, and I appreciate that the mayor's glad that this is in our lap, because this is, I mean, you want to get families passionate about conversations about education. Start talking about moving lines, and so I think that we continue to kind of watch. Like I said, the school board did an evaluation because I think there was a question of, is it already getting to the point where we need to make a move? And a subcommittee of the board looked at it, looked at the projections, and decided we weren't at that spot yet. There's a lot of ongoing conversation as we deal with class sizes and differential in class sizes between places that goes on. And like I think I said the other day when we were in the library, I said we don't have an enrollment facilities problem per se. There is the potential for a distribution issue. Again, we're not to the point yet where that's happening, but depending on what happens, as we get further out Route 1, there's a possibility if there's ongoing growth at a price point that families can afford, that we're going to have to consider the possibility that looking at those types of things.
I know, obviously the number of students at Portsmouth High School has dramatically decreased since when my father went there. They used to have morning students and afternoon students. And then I know the number has decreased since I went there, graduated in 2001. And 179 students over 10 years is a lot. If that rate continues to increase, I would be scared. You did mention the numbers going down a little bit at Little Harbor and then going up a little bit at Dondero. Could you just touch on New Franklin at all? Are those numbers stagnant?
And I think we're reasonably stagnant, but let me say reasonably and leave me a little bit of buffer to. I mean, most of the play right now is in those other two schools.
Yeah. Okay.
So
thank you.
You're welcome.
Your Honor, I can answer the question about the number of teachers increase, and Judy was kind enough to remind me that on page 144 of the FY22 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or the ACFR, it lists all the employees by function, by group, in the general fund. And so for schools, just general fund, not special revenue accounts, that number is 12. 12 new teachers in the last 10 years.
Assistant Mayor.
Can you remind me how much of the ESSER funds we have left?
Nathan, I'm going to pull you up for that one.
It cocked my head to the side.
So did I bring it? I didn't bring it. So we are wrapping up the consumption of the ESSER 2 funds, which are about $1.2 million. Those will be expended by the time we hit September of this year. That has been spent largely on supports of return to in-person education. It's been spent on the positions that the superintendent described tonight. It's been spent on summer and after-school programming, other enrichments. And as we look now to the following year, which is the last year of ESSER, we have $2.7 million wrapped up in ESSER 3. We have talked about roughly $1.5 million of that being allocated against the window project at Little Harbor and Dondero. We'll be back talking to you at some point for bond authorization to do the Lister project not in ESSER, and we will do the window project in ESSER instead. We're working on a emergency communications project, $350,000, radios and repeaters and the like throughout the district schools. And then we have lingering those positions that are staying in ESSER for another year. And then we have dollars being allocated right now against inventory turn on Chromebooks and devices in the buildings, and more work on summer school and after school. And so there continues to be a plan for how we would spend, but a significant chunk of those dollars still haven't been spent. At this point, essentially, all of the $2.7 million are unspent. They're just spoken for. But I do think that there are still, haven't bought the Chromebooks, haven't done the after-school programs for the next year, et cetera. So there's somewhere in the order of, $250,000, $300,000 that could easily be redirected if there were different priorities. But right now, that's the plan that's been laid out and published.
So some of those programs that you just spoke of, will we see those bouncing back into the school budget in 2 years when the expansion of after-school programs and the funding of summer programs?
I think Councilor Tabor asked a similar question before, maybe the other day, and I think we're going to be in a position where we're going to have to make some difficult choices. I mean, we're talking just the positions we were talking about. It would be $430,000 coming back to the local budget. The idea behind the federal funds was to do two things. One, to give us a boost during a period of time where there are unique sets of needs. Two, with any federal dollars, there's also an opportunity for us to pilot things to then determine whether or not it's worthy of local dollars. So we know that we have some difficult conversations ahead of us as we move into the next budget cycle.
Thank you.
Councilor Bagwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. And just to kind of expound on the fact that we, over 10 years, it sounds like we lost about 180 students enrollment-wise, but we've actually gained and not lost teachers. I just want to point out, and it would maybe be nice to have some feedback at a future meeting, requirements have gone up substantially in regards to special education, para-educators. From when most of us were kids, I think it was a much more efficient system, probably not as good a system as far as meeting all of our youth's needs. So it would be nice to have some feedback on where the increases were and where the reductions were, rather than just the one overall number.
And I think we're happy to do that analysis. I think what I would assume is similar to many places in the region, and not just in New Hampshire, is that the composition of those FTEs are not necessarily teachers per se, but professionals. And the composition of that set of professionals, I think, would have evolved during that period of time a bit. What we're doing more and more of is work that was, traditionally the grounds of other social safety, other social services at this point, coming from the perspective of students due to a combination of whether it's mental health needs or it's other issues. We're trying to bridge the gap of those needs in order for students to access their education. And I think 10 to 15 years ago, communities had a different perspective on that. That wasn't really the school's work, and either some other social service organization was going to take care of it, or it just wasn't going to get done. And some of that's just a value judgment.
Thank you.
Councilor Tabor.
Thanks, Mayor. Could the math tutor be funded by ESSER for FY24?
So the math tutor, make sure I've got, I mean, we could, I think with the type of money Nathan's talking about, I mean, we could look at that being the case, yes.
Okay.
I would, if I may, I'd answer the question by saying, yes, that's part of what I was thinking. We had left dollars anticipating the likelihood, or not likelihood, excuse me, the possibility that those two positions that we're still hopeful will make it in would again not make it in. So when the assistant mayor asked about dollars, in my head, I'm thinking, well, there's at least that amount of money that's not really spoken for because it was reserved for the possibility of having to fund those. But then it creates quite the cliff.
So this is,
now there's at least 4 or 5 positions next year.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think this becomes the challenge, so that, 450 becomes, you start creeping towards 700 in terms of what we would have to face either to bring back to the local budget or just completely eliminate. And that'd be a lot of people walking out the door at the same time. So I'd be a little worried about, I think cliff is a good way to look at it. And I think whenever we can, and I understand the fiscal pressures for all of us, when we can create a glide path where we do some of that incrementally, I think that's serves our students and families the best.
Yeah, so we're talking about 2 of the 4 positions this year, maybe 2 of the 4 positions next year's. What you and your board would like to do.
Two, not necessarily two being added, but us being 2 of the positions going in and us having some really difficult conversations about the other 2 in the next cycle.
And your board, I think, really believes the social worker position has had a dramatic positive impact at the high school and wants to expand that to the middle school. But tell us the case for the math tutor.
Yeah, I think, I think when we look at the impacts of the data that we have, and we look at the impacts on students, where academically where we suffered was math, which makes some sense because of the nature of how math is taught, and it's more linear. If you have some steps in there that students miss during that COVID period, it's harder to make up that inside of an existing classroom, and so you need some additional support. So I think from the school board's perspective, they saw 2 overarching kind of things that they thought were most important. One, they know the impact on students' mental health as a result of what we've just gone through, and they wanted to enhance that and enhance outreach to families. And then 2 was academically the real concern in terms of us continuing to be a school district that people see as very successful and preparing students for their lives after school was to fill in some of those gaps on the math side. And it could be that some of the work from the math tutor is stuff that we, hopefully in some of these cases you work your way out of that type of stuff. But I also appreciate what Councilor Cook was saying about sometimes when you add positions, it is difficult for those positions to go away in the long run as well.
Thanks.
Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I understand Councilor Tabor's point of looking for efficiencies where we can, but I would worry that if we were to leave all the positions for next year, instead of shifting them from ESLR to the regular budget, there would be an inclination to maybe not approve all of them. Speaking personally, just seeing firsthand my daughter and her friends in middle school, when COVID hit, I was like, oh, this is great, she's missing middle school. That's, everybody's, or almost everybody's worst couple of years of schooling, so,
Not here in Portsmouth School District.
Those are great years to miss. But what really happened was she went through her middle school years, her freshman, and now she's in her sophomore year. So I think across the board what happened is we saw such a big delay. And probably as you go younger with the children, as it's a bigger percentage of their entire lives, that delay is even more substantial. So I think we're, as adults, we're pretty well out of the COVID hole. But I think our student population is still suffering greatly from it, and will continue to suffer from it for the next, 5 to 10 years maybe, as those younger kids kind of grow up. They're always going to be playing catch up from the generation before them. So I do have some concerns about that cliff position-wise.
Agree. Councilor Bagley. Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you, by chance, have any kind of forecast on what the testing numbers look like for 2023 yet? I'm assuming the students.
I don't, we're in process.
Okay.
So I don't know yet, and that will be another, big data point for us as to where we think we actually are at.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it.
Next up is Deputy Police Chief Mike Maloney.
Thank you, Manager, Your Honor. I do have some handouts as well that can go along with this. Best you served, we can hand them out if you wish, or whatever you'd like. Karen, could you help?
Hand them out.
Hand them out.
You can
All
give
right.
one and we can pass around. We're efficient most of the time.
Do the SRO one first.
Just give us stacks so we can pass them.
So again, good evening and thanks. Mike Maloney, Deputy Chief, the Police Department. So with respect to the SRO at first, the colored handout we have is a detailed breakdown of a school resource officer position within the police department and how that's broken down, everything from the PT testing, the psychological evaluations, the medical testing, all the pre-employment workups, everything to uniforms and equipment, and then salaries. So you'll see a cost on a yearly basis of the salary $79,985. When you add in the benefits, you're looking at $86,313, and then adding an additional 32 hours of training a year per the state standards. It's $88,013. So that would be for a new officer, everything included, with the exception of a cruiser with outfitting. You'll see on the right-hand side there, $46,000 if we were to purchase a cruiser to go along with that officer. So that was a question that was posed with respect to the school department and the police department. But those are our latest numbers on the cost of a police officer. The other question that was asked that we'll answer here tonight was a very good question on the amount of overtime expenditures that we had in FY22. We were budgeted for about $600,000 worth of overtime. We came in north of $900,000 in overtime. And we have, on your handout, you'll see a Portsmouth Police Department overtime practices memo. And then along with that is a further breakdown. So what I'll give you a verbal but specific breakdown on overtime expenditures. In the additional paperwork that you have, you will see a very, very specific, to the penny, line-by-line item of the overtime expenditures for that year. So the majority of the overtime spent in 2022 was for coverages, followed by investigations, and then training. And coverages are for absences due to any number of reasons, any type of leave, any sort of position that needs somebody to be in it, and because of course we're a 24/7, 365 department, and we have a minimum number of officers that are required to be working at any given time, we don't really have any flexibility where if there is a vacancy, we can either choose to fill it or not fill it. Many times it has to be filled because of the minimum manning requirements that we're obligated to have within the city. Investigation speaks for themselves. That's when a crime is committed. That's when an officer is involved in a DWI arrest at the closing hour of their shift. And it takes probably 3.5 hours to do a process of standard DWI. And if you catch a DWI at the end of your shift, you can't just pawn it off on somebody else. You have to complete that paperwork. That's a number that stays pretty consistent throughout the years. And then training is our third highest driver of overtime. And with respect to coverage and vacancies, that very much ties into our challenges with recruitment and retention. And if we go back to 2021, there was a period of time at the police department where we had 16 full-time employees over an 18-month period retire, resign, move on. So for a period of a year and a half or so, we had police officers and civilians leaving at a rate of about 1 per month. And in addition to that, the amount of time that it takes to replace a police officer can be upwards of a year. So if you have a police officer who retires on January 1st of 2022, it's very realistic that you don't have a replacement for him or her until January of 2023. And when you couple that with the fact that our recruitment and our retaining of employees is tremendously challenging right now, you're only adding to that time that it takes to fill those vacancies. The numbers of people that apply for these positions are lower and lower. Another big driver of where we had overtime was in our dispatch and communications division. That division is budgeted for 10 full-time dispatchers and 1 communications supervisor. At times in 2022, we were down to 2 full-time dispatchers and 1 communications supervisor. So 80% of the staff we didn't even have employed. So the amount of overtime that was used to fill those vacant shifts was extraordinary, but needed because of the extraordinary number of vacancies. Any given day, for example, with the number of vacancies we have with sworn positions or unsworn positions, right now there are 5 unfilled police officer positions that we are actively trying to hire for today. So when you combine the 5 vacancies that exist today with the 7 or so people that we have out on long-term injury, illness, maternity, we have 2 on long-term military deployment, you're left with a day-to-day staffing level of possibly 20% below what your ideal staffing number is. So when you look at that 2022 overtime number, we had an unprecedented number of departures over a relatively short period of time. We had some people, for the first time in my 24 years at the police department, we had a police officer leave the Portsmouth Police Department and go to another New Hampshire police department, which has never happened before. But the bottom line is that's the way things are these days. If you're a highly qualified candidate, you can basically write your ticket and go wherever you want. And this was an instance of that. And along with the fact that the unpredictableness of unscheduled long-term military deployments, we had 3 full-time employees, sworn employees, on unplanned, unpredictable long-term injury or illness. And when you combine all those unexpected long-term vacancies with vacancies that already exist because of open positions, combine that with recruitment and retention challenges, combine that with you have to have a minimum number of people to pull off your job every day, we had almost $300,000 worth of overtime expended above and beyond what was budgeted. So that's the general but more specific overtime answer. And again, if you look line by line on some of those handouts right there, you'll get to see by division exactly where the overtime was spent according to each division. So I hope that answers the question of overtime and how we came to spend so much in overtime. If there's any additional questions, I'd be more than happy to give it a shot.
Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for the presentation. I have 2 hopefully relatively quick questions. If I'm reading the SRO officer pamphlet right, minus the cost of the cruiser or say transportation, that first year it's roughly $170,000 because we're looking at $80,000 to kind of get them up to speed with training and all the outfitting. And then once they're up to speed, we're looking at a $88,000 a year salary.
No, and if Karen, if you need to speak to that as well, the $79,985 includes salary while they're in the police department. So the final number would be the 88,000, Karen? Or is that in addition?
What we tried to,
The 88,000 includes benefits.
yes.
And the
And what-
additional 32 hours of training.
And what we tried to show is when we first bring on an officer, after all their training, before they can even get on the street, it costs us about $80,000. That's the 79,000. Once they're here, an annual cost based on FY24 numbers is 86,313 for a total, just for an annual salary benefit.
So I guess if I understand correctly, just bringing an officer on, whether it's SRO or regular officer, you're going to run those costs regardless. And then once they've kind of finished all the training and all the outfitting, we're looking at the 88,000 a year going forward.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then the second one I have on the FY22 overtime hours paid. Is it because our fiscal year turns over in July? But I'm surprised to see July is a pretty low overtime hours number, and June and August are relatively high.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you can see in kind of the monthly time, that we really don't have a specific time of the year where we have more overtime or less. And with respect to not just the fact that the fiscal year begins in July, but you can see that we really spend it throughout the year equally. There's not, sometimes you might expect less overtime in a certain part of the year, and other times when you don't expect to have that overtime because of unexpected vacancies, you would have it. But we really don't see a correlation in time of year, generally speaking.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. I was looking here at the charts, and on a quick glance, it seems like open beat coverage had an increase of almost 50%.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what exactly that all entails?
Open beat is another example of having a vacancy in a beat would be a beat on the street or a uniformed police officer patrolling. So we call those beats. An open beat would mean that either the person who is assigned to that beat is unavailable, or we simply never had somebody for that beat to begin with. So open beat is synonymous with not having enough people to do the job. So the overtime is needed to fill that open beat. And again, it's an open beat because it's a mandatory fill. We don't have the option of not filling it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Just to follow up on that, the 7,700 hours, 2022, 4,948 hours, 2021, those are the highest that we've had since the last 20 years.
Yeah.
The only other time it's above 3,000 even is in FY16 and 2009. Everything else is roughly in the, goes low as 700, but 2,000 seems to be where we are operating on a fully staffed. Has there been any changes to the beats over the years? Like
Beats-
patrols, has there been an increase in the number of patrols that we've done if we've not filled them? Has there been a demand on more as the city has grown in any number of ways? Has anything in terms of our patrol changed over the last 21 years?
Yes, the number of officers that are, where we were 20 years ago compared to where we are now has changed slightly, but not drastically. The requirements of what the police department is being asked to do have changed from what they were 20 years ago to what they are now. However, it doesn't necessarily reflect on lower or higher staffing levels. So at any given time, do we have more officers on the street right now than we did 20 years ago? Quite frankly, we may have less than when I started. We would have a number of officers in the downtown, we'd have 3 on a busy Friday, Saturday night. The city's very much changed in a sense of where the police
No more Jack Quigleys.
No, no. So the numbers, as far as the number of officers we had in the street, 20 years ago, we had more officers available to us on the street because the city was a much very different city 20 years ago. We needed all those people on the street at midnight. We don't necessarily see that now, but and it's not just the patrol officers, it's our community relation officers, it's our SROs, it's all the other things that we do in the community that we're doing more of now that we did less of 20 years ago when we just went around and broke up fights all the time.
So, and I think that's understood, and I think from an open position standpoint, we have 5 open positions with an ask of a social worker, and then to add back in the position of the, how are we staffed on the dispatchers, just really quickly?
So today we have 6 full-time dispatchers. That does not include the interim communications supervisor. 3 out of those 6 are still in training.
Okay.
So we only have, and the 4th just got off of training today. So
congrats.
We have 4 that are eligible to work on their own solo, but we have the others in training. So, and again, the training curve for that is sometimes 12 to 14 weeks from when a new dispatcher has day one to the time that they're able to work a shift on their own.
And with a social worker being asked as a part of the budget, what impact do you feel a social worker will have on the regular operations of the police department? And I would love to hear an answer. I mean, I think from a standpoint of being able to engage in a way that's productive and minimizes risks to both our citizens and your department. But from a staffing standpoint, do you see any synergies in terms of a social worker taking on activities that might take up an officer's more of their time, either from a paperwork standpoint or just from a time standpoint with an individual?
Sure, and I'll give you an example of that. So our community outreach officer, Detective Jones, you've probably all mostly seen her at some point out in the community doing something. She has kind of been pulled into a mental health professional liaison role, which is not really her job. She put out an email this morning about a resident that just got out of the state hospital, and Detective Jones is staying plugged in with that individual in order to lessen the burden of the police resources that we have to spend dealing with her repetitive mental health issues. But quite frankly, that's not Detective Jones's job. She shouldn't be doing that. She does it because she's really good at it. And one of the questions I had asked the new dispatcher a couple months ago, I said, what do you think? Is it everything like you expected? Is it nothing like you expected? How's the job? How's it look on paper, and how's it look in real life? And she said, the one thing that blew me away when I got in the door after a few weeks was the amount of phone calls, the amount of time that we deal with the same people time and time and time again. So you say, how many times does an average person in their life have an opportunity to call the police over the course of their life? Maybe a couple. We have people that call the police department 3 to 4 times a day, every single day. And a lot of them have mental illness. A lot of them have mental illness combined with drugs and alcohol. And by having that mental health professional on staff, that would give us the ability to not tie up a patrol resource with responding to the call for service that is really, it's a nuisance call for us, but it's a call that we have to manage. So the whole idea of the social worker is to fill the gap between us, the state resources, the mobile crisis teams, so that we have somebody in the police department who can follow up with that individual and not tie up the time of an officer who could otherwise be slowing down cars on South Street.
If a constituent asks, there's 5 open positions, could we fill one of those positions with a social worker? What is your response to that? If there's efficiencies to be gained in terms of the maybe some of the frequent flyers that engage with the police department?
So I would say to the constituent, you can't, because those 5 open vacancies are for positions that we already have, so you can't take them away. But the 5 open positions we have right now are for previously budgeted officers. The social worker position is for 1 full-time employee, civilian, on top of our 5 vacancies. But, we've already previously identified, the council has already approved our number of full-time officers. So, at this point, to take a step back and try to hire 4 officers and 1 mental health professional, I think would be a step back for us because we already have those 5 vacancies are caused by those 16 people, or are still trying to fill those 16 people that left a year and a half ago. But it just takes us that long to try to replace that spot.
Maybe I'll ask it, and I can appreciate that. And I think we have to be, every year's a new year, but it's 400-year-old city. We have, certain things that we do. And I think, it is evident from a standpoint of the overtime that we have a patrol beat issue here when we are at the highest amount of overtime that we have ever experienced, at least in 20 years. And it is it's double from last year, but it's quadruple from what would be a normally staffed year. Given that a school resource officer has many of the same responsibilities as a patrol officer, but obviously is a different type of hire, but doesn't end their day at 3 o'clock and works weekends, would there be any synergies? And again, we can't direct the schools to do what they're doing, but if there was, would it be a different conversation to say one of those 5 open positions we would rehire or allocate that that budget to a rehiring of what we previously had a number of years ago from a SRO covering 3 elementary schools?
Yeah, that's reasonable. That would be a reallocation basically of our organization chart at that point. So we had 2 additional police officer positions added to the budget last year. Would it be conceivable to then do an internal reorganization as to where that asset goes and call one of those positions an SRO position? I think that would be feasible and something that certainly the chief would take a look at as far as that internal shuffle. But I think that...
And that would probably, just from a, we control the bottom line budget. So from a budgeting perspective, it is there if the school department wanted to have that conversation from at least a budgeting standpoint and being in the hiring process that we are in.
Correct. Yeah, and make no mistake about it, we wouldn't hire for an SRO. We would conduct a normal hiring process for a police officer, and then, a new person that we hire, we don't hire them as our SRO. They would be hired as a police officer, and then we would, have an internal process to take an existing person and make them the SRO. But, the SRO becomes valuable to us in the summer too, because in the summer, when the kids aren't in schools, the SROs are folded back into the patrol division. So if anybody's curious as to what the SROs do during the summer, the SROs put on their uniforms and they push a cruiser and answer calls for service. So they also do take a little time off because they need it, because we don't allow much time off during the school year, but they do go back to supplement patrol in the summer.
Thank you. Councilor Brewer.
Thank you, Your Honor. And thank you, Your Honor, for bringing up that issue. I really appreciate having this conversation, Deputy Chief Maloney. Like I said before, growing up as an elementary school student and knowing Officer Friendly and having that contact and having that security was a very nice way to grow up. I would love to see the kids of Portsmouth today have that same security. And I really appreciate you getting all these numbers to us. It looks like it'd be 11 and a half months to train someone once found the right applicant. So I understand there would be a lag time in getting someone at the schools if this was to happen. But I just want to thank you for having this conversation.
Sure.
I really appreciate it.
Ms. Councilman, Assistant Mayor.
Thank you. What are, if you could explain to me the reasons of the delayed hire for the social worker? As we know, it's a big push in getting this position. Is it strictly based on budget?
My understanding that it was, partly because of the budget,
Why don't
correct?
I jump in? Judy and I ran a calculation to have all of the proposed positions, with the exception of the recreation supervisor, which was planned to start at the half-year mark anyway, pushed to 3/4, with the recognition that if July 1st is when the funds become available, the likelihood of identifying the candidate, getting them on board much before October 1st was pretty slim. And so we priced or budgeted all those positions at 3/4 of a year.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Bagwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just looking at these numbers, and it looks like it's fiscal year 21 and 22, a little bit to the mayor's point about the really increased overtime. I'm seeing that the open beat dispatch vacancies is almost 7,000 hours last year. Is in reading in the paper and understanding how short-staffed our dispatch has been and how we've had to farm out dispatch to Rockingham County. If we can get back to close to full staff, are you expecting a big reduction in that number, if I'm interpreting it correctly? And then two, how does the funding work if we have to farm out dispatch? Does that show up as overtime or in a different cost center?
So, number one, yes. So you see that extremely high number in open beat dispatch because at times we were operating with 2 out of 10 dispatchers. So that's why that number is so big. When we do get full staffed, and we will, we are clawing our way back there. It's a long road, but we're getting there. When we do get back full staffed in dispatch, yeah, that open beat coverage dispatch will severely be cut because we have the people to sit on the chair, sit in the chair. With respect to dispatching out of Rockingham County, there's no cost to us for that at all. That's not reflected in our budget or what you see there.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Okay.
Deputy
Sure.
Chief. All right, I think.
So just
back
want to wrap up a couple of things, Your Honor. Judy's going to tackle the bullet that's labeled collective bargaining contingency, and I'll tackle the last one.
Okay, so collective bargaining contingency, as we know, we have 16 collective bargaining units in the city. And we have, heading into fiscal year 24, we have 6 unions that have not been settled. So in order to be, responsible in the budget, we put a dollar figure in there kind of as a holding place. I believe the question was, what is the breakdown of the $563,000? And we shy away from that question because we don't want to cause any unfair labor practices through the negotiations. So we basically could not budget anything in that line item, and then as each union was coming forward and had a tentative agreement, you do a supplemental appropriation. But then you have several supplemental appropriations throughout the year. So we put in kind of an aggregate number to kind of be a placeholder and to offset some hits on the fund balance. So as you have tentative agreements come forward, you also provided a cost out of those agreements. And so what we do is kind of look at where we're at and what we have available. So that's the answer to the $563,000. It's just a kind of an estimate and not really associated with each union.
And I'll take the last bullet, which is a bit of a catch-all, and tried my best to sum up what I heard some counselors referencing, which is, can you quantify or can you speak to things in the budget that you could label must-haves versus nice-to-haves? And I think that's subjective in the eye of the question asker and question answerer, and certainly some of the must-haves would include education and public safety and providing clean water and wastewater services and staying in compliance with regulatory authorities. And there are some nice-to-haves that differ among the residents. Some make great use of the library, some never frequent the library. Some items that came on the scene rather quickly and without following the traditional CIP process. I'm told the senior center was one of them when the opportunity for the Doble Center came up. The skate park's another great example of making that happen in advance of the formal CIP effort, if you will. But I think it's important for the staff to recognize that the nice-to-haves versus the must-haves all roll up into a budget, which is a statement of values. And to the best of our ability, we have tried to put forward the budget that meets the council goals as we understand them to be. You know, we feel strongly about what services we do provide that are responsible and cost-effective and speak to the high quality level of service and the quality of life and place that we have here in the city. So that's a segue to if there are services that we provide well or services that we should or should not provide anymore. I think that's a conversation for the whole community to have in conjunction with the council. It's not something we could really turn on a dime in the next 6 weeks and try to think quickly about how to impact this budget. People have asked, and it's a fair question to say, what's the status of flash vote, and how do you truly intend to get the pulse of all of the residents and all of the community, not just sometimes the voices we tend to hear. And Monty and Suzanne worked very hard to stand up the relationship with flash vote, and we are approaching, but are not quite at what I'm told is called a statistically significant cohort. We have in excess of 600 people signed up to be part of flash vote. Ideally, it's more like 750 or 800. So when we get there, we plan to roll out some surveys. But again, I think that spoke to what's the desire to learn from the community. Can we get some sort of anticipatory set of answers? And I think the question is not yet. So for this budget, what we have here is what we feel most strongly about as a reflection of the goals set by this council. So with that, the discussion we would center on would be to seek your guidance and to understand where you might want to go in the final analysis, because this is our last get-together before we would propose to bring the budget forward for formal approval at the June 5th meeting. And before I completely stop talking, Judy would want me to tell you that in your packet are draft resolutions that speak to what needs to be passed as part of the budget. There are a total of 6 resolutions: municipal fees, general fund, water fund, sewer fund, all the special revenue funds, which would include ARPA, and then the last speaks to our annual investment policy that has to be voted on. So with that, I will stop talking and stop sharing and turn it back to you, Mayor.
So next up is we're going to recap the public dialogue sessions, but if there are questions related to what was just said, Councilor Moreau.
As I was listening to our IT director speak, I was thinking, and she's talking about how long it's going to take to actually bring our new finance software into existence and line. I was thinking, because the whole reason for the second deputy finance director was sort of succession planning, but does it make sense to sort of hold off a year until we're actually starting to use the new software and have it be part of, instead of learning an old system and then a future new system, just work towards a future new system?
The answer to that is there are a significant number of high-level finance staff that may seek retirement in the next 12 to 18 months. So that'll be a huge hole to fill, and that's the reason for the current and immediate need for some succession planning.
Councilor Bagwell.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, City Manager, for that wrap-up. I know I was one of the councilors to kind of ask for the nice-to-have versus the need-to-have, and broadly speaking, I'm happy with the budget that has been presented. I know it's an increase, and I've heard from residents, that are concerned about the increase, but I do believe that as a city, we really provide a first-class experience for our residents. We have a lot of nice things that maybe not all cities can provide. Being cognizant that, as property taxes go up and And some people's, because of where they've lived for a long time, their neighborhood becomes much more valuable than it used to be. It becomes harder and harder for them to be in their homes. And balancing that need with, a large number of residents that want to have a good school system, want to have good recreation opportunities, want to have an excellent library like we do have. I think we're okay right now, but my concern is more long-term, over the next 4 to 5 years. If we continue to see, I know it's enterprise funds, but if we continue to see sewer requirements going up that require massive capital investments, if we continue to see legal and regulatory requirements get more and more expensive, if we continue to see, as we saw tonight, IT stuff get more and more expensive, I think there could be a point in the future where Portsmouth may have to think about having to make cuts to some of those nice-to-haves. And I think the sooner we identify what those are, we can have a better conversation as a community if it ever does come to that point. So that was, my request was not necessarily for this budget or maybe even next year's budget, but more looking long-term down the road. If we do have to make sacrifices, we should, start to identify where those places would be so we can have an informed conversation as a community.
Hey, Councilor Bagley, Councilor Denton.
Thank you. 2 comments. First, my apologies to the public, staff, and the council. I had incorrectly put this in my phone at 7 o'clock. Planned accordingly, left something else at 6:30, sat down on the bench outside with my dinner to take my first bite at 6:45, and I saw Attorney Trevor McCord come out, and I asked, why are all the other councilors' cars here? And he said this started at 6. So, again, my apologies. The other comment, just to give the council, staff, and especially Ellen Tully heads up, when it comes to the welfare department, I want to put my other cap on and request that the Central Veterans Council budget, all of $750, gets doubled for next year to $1,500. For those who do not know, the Central Veterans Council organizes and MCs all of the veteran ceremonies, Memorial Day ceremonies in town, and the costs have gone up. Just to give you one idea, 3 reefs for the 3 ceremonies used to cost $150 in total. Now a single reef costs $150. The miniature flags now cost $147. So I got a call the Saturday of our retreat from the treasurer from the Central Veterans Council saying that, hey, we're actually don't have enough cash on hand. And full disclosure, I'm not just the liaison to the Central Veterans Council. I found myself as the president of the Central Veterans Council, hence why I'm emceeing all the ceremonies and I'm involved with that. So, thank you.
Hey, Councilor Denton.
Mayor, are you comfortable if Ellen were to speak to that?
Certainly.
Thank you.
The Central Veterans Council is funded through the outside social service grants, and every year the grant applications go out, and I strongly encourage anybody who is submitting an application to ask for what you need. And we're happy to look at that. And the applications usually go out at the end of November, and we'll have asking for it to be returned by sometime in the middle of January. So be looking for that, and if you didn't get it, if it went to somebody else this year, by all means, contact me and I'll make sure that it gets to you.
Thanks, Ellen.
Any other questions of the city manager of finance? I guess I just had one on fund balance. So looking back over the years, we used to not list out, or at least in the document that I was looking at it from the FY16 budget, the 10 years previously, the assigned fund balance. Was that not a practice that we used, we allocated assigned fund balance during the year?
Oh, okay, I think I understand your question, right. So in this case, because we're using unassigned fund balance, you're talking about an FY24, right?
Yep.
So what happens is we are going to be utilizing $2 million out of the unassigned fund balance. But when we are preparing the budget, with that, how do I say this?
Well, when you when you are going to use the 2 million in '23, you have now assigned it.
You assigned it, so it
So
comes
we have
out
to
of
move it out of unassigned to assigned for '24.
Okay. We didn't used to have that distinction in the budget, or at least the budget documents. When we looked back, we didn't split it out from committed fund balance and unassigned fund balance. Did we just have that as part of the committed, did we move that into, when it became unassigned, did we move it into committed fund balance then?
It would go from unassigned to assigned. And let me look at that. Because we always have an assigned fund balance. It just may not have been part of that graph.
Okay. I'll just assume that it wasn't part of that graph.
Oh, but
Is-
it is there, assigned in FY 17, 16. I mean-
Right, no, in this it is. I was looking at a previous budget document
Oh,
from
okay.
10 years ago, because this
Oh.
only goes back to 16. So I was trying to get a sense of what we use unassigned fund balance. And we're using at least, in FY, from FY 10 to FY 16, we're using the same amount, roughly, of 4.8 million as we would be using in the last, I'm rounding up a little bit, from 4.8 to 5.4. Given that the budget has grown, more significantly, would we expect our use of unassigned fund balance to grow, or largely remain static in terms of the previous 10 years?
Okay. So this chart here of the use of fund balance is really not all-inclusive of total fund balance. So, and we probably added the assigned fund balance in here because we're demonstrating what we use as a supplemental appropriation or through the budget process. When we, our forecast is that our unassigned fund balance will relatively stay the same. And the total fund balance overall, which would include all the 5 categories of fund balance, is also roughly staying the same. It's actually decreased a small amount over the last same period of time here. From FY 17 to 22, it actually decreased like $472,000. So, but that includes unassigned fund balance, the 5 components. So as we forecast out, in our projections, it is relatively staying the same, unless we start taking some major supplemental appropriations going forward or whatnot.
Okay, and I guess my last question on this topic, and I certainly appreciate the coming in below the expectation from a 4.5% of what the council laid out in terms of the expectation of a budget increase, but given the loss of revenues and that the tax rate increases, at least our expectation of the tax rate increase, barring some recalibration on the state level, would be comes in at just north of 6%. That's where I would, and don't need it now, but if we continue to stay above the 10% level of fund balance, why we would not consider using more of that fund balance for softening the blow of the loss of revenue from a one-time standpoint, given that it was not, it is, going back to FY, 10 and 11, where we had a greater use of fund balance in 11, why would we not view that in the same terms of now, given the economic climate we find ourselves?
So the rule of thumb with using the unassigned fund balance is to not use it for reoccurring expenses as much as possible. When you start drawing on unassigned fund balance for operating expenses, it just gets deeper and deeper in the hole, because then you're compounding that need to raise taxes in the next couple of years. So we're trying to soften the blow from the one-time revenues here by utilizing the $2 million, but also being responsible for the future budgets, because then you're in fiscal year 25, you're going to have to then raise that $2 million. But we're also forecasting out that we, see that there's some surplus that we're projecting for FY '23. So we feel comfortable with, utilizing the $2 million here. You don't want to go too close to your 10% if possible, because that's where, we get rated every year when we do our bond issues, and if Standard & Poor's starts seeing that the fund balance is depleting, or we're having a hard time staying within our range, then, that could have an effect on the bond rating as well. Now, there is a provision in that ordinance that says if you do fall below 10%, because you can fall below 10%, that there has to be a plan by the council in order to replenish the unassigned fund balance by an amount to cover the shortfall from being below 10% in a 2-year term period. So,
And where are we, just to remind us all, in terms of a percentage of?
Oh, so 13, we're at 13%. It is,
How much would we have to deplete to get to 10%?
I think there's a couple million.
Couple million?
10% of the budget would be about 13 million, and we're at about 17 million, so. 'Cause the budget's
We can
137.
get that number specifically, but,
You know what I'm saying?
right, so, and we're,
Yeah, but with those numbers, we're above it, right? If you said we're at 17 million, and if it's,
Right, so the 17 million is the 13.
okay,
points.
okay, so 4 million, okay, so
Right.
there's
Yeah, 3, you.
3 and change.
Right.
Okay, got it. I guess from as the budget grows from a standpoint of just being a larger budget, wondering whether or not the 10 to 17% is the, if that range, if we're going to continue to stay in the middle of that range versus the lower end of that range. But it's a bigger conversation, and Councilor Cook wants to get into it on this, or maybe something
Similar,
else.
unrelated, but similar question around ARPA funds. I think the city manager said that you had identified an additional $759,000 in eligible ARPA funds, but only using $304,000 of that?
No.
Or recommended only using an additional
To
$304,000?
this point, the budget document as presented includes 304, and we're looking to identify additional funds to bring it to a total of 759 in this budget, which equates to about 11 cents on the tax rate.
The follow-on I have on that is how much would we have left in ARPA funding?
We have left 4.473680, of which 3.718400 is revenue loss, and 755,280 is restricted to the buckets, if you will, for public health or negative economic impacts or investment in water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. So to recap that answer, 3.7 is essentially unrestricted, and 755,000 would be restricted.
And finally, are there any other projects within the CIP budget, for example, that could be funded using ARPA funds?
We essentially, and Andrew and Judy jump in, we combed through and sought eligibility for all the capital outlay items. You cannot use ARPA for items that already have debt. And so we really culled out everything that was eligible. It would be fair to say that as staff approaches, how do you spend the remaining ARPA funds? Certainly a certain allocation should go toward the items that the COVID Response Task Force talked about. We know there are some needs related to the relocation of tenants and the appropriate fit-up of community campus. And we thought it would be appropriate to get into a conversation specific to ARPA and the rest of the funds once we get through budget. But to our way of thinking, we applied all of the eligible ARPA funding that we could toward this budget.
Thank you.
Councilor Bagwin.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's one of my favorite graphs, but I can't find it. To the mayor's point about 2010, I believe we didn't have the AAA bond rating at that point. We've had it for about 10 years now. So that would put us
2013, I believe, was the first year that we had the AAA bond rating.
And I mean, I think our council and all councils hopefully going forward will be in the unenviable position that you can only go down from here.
Right.
We can't do anything to improve that because we have the best rating possible. And just looking at the unassigned fund balance, if, you know, in the world I work in manufacturing, you know, if you have a tolerance between, say, 10 and 17%, you're always trying to stay somewhere in the middle there. So I do understand the desire to lower the tax rate, but I also would counterpoint that you know, having a robust rainy day fund and having a AAA bond rating are going to give us long-term savings that we should put a pretty high value on.
I will bring to your attention on page 116 of the budget document, it does show a graph starting with fiscal year 99 to fiscal year 22 that shows some correlation between our increasing of our unassigned fund balance to our AAA bond rating. One component, of course, to the whole rating from Standard & Poor's, but as we've increased that percentage and you know, and maintained over the last several years in that mid-range has been very helpful.
Great, and thank you. That was the graph I was looking for, but couldn't find.
Councilor Cook?
Thank you, Your Honor. Since I think that what I heard the city manager say is that most of the positions, new positions created, are funded at 3/4 of a year.
Right.
Do we have a figure on what the automatic then increase would be next year for fully funded positions?
The delta for legal, yep, the delta for reducing by a quarter the ask in this current fiscal, the proposed fiscal year is $141,574. So that's the number saved by funding at 3/4 the positions requested.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? I like your graph too, Councilor Bagley. It looks like the number is 11, just as that one factor, $11.8 million got us a AAA bond rating, and now we're at $14 million. But there's always reason to have a rainy day fund, but just on that one graph alone, 11.8 was a sufficient enough qualification at that. But Councilor Tabor.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I think we've been smart to use fund balance this year to the degree we have, but I wouldn't want to dip into it further for two reasons. We don't have contracts with police and fire, and those could potentially involve more than we budgeted, and we'd have to decide whether we'd have to do a supplemental. And we have litigation that is pending, and if that came to us, we might have to do a supplemental for that. So, and I think all of us are stewards of the AAA bond rating, and it's essential that we keep that.
All right, let's have the recaps now. Who would like to go first? I know Josh was designated himself from ours. That was at the senior center.
Gladly speak to it. So the senior center's public, what are we calling it? Public hearing? Public dialogue. Public comment. So that actually did start at 7 o'clock. It was relatively well attended by the public. The top things discussed. The first one was there's 3 representatives from the WSCA, Portsmouth Community Radio there, hoping we'll be able to somehow help them when it comes to finding a new location. There was much discussion regarding the collective bargaining agreements as far as when it comes to increases in costs overall. And there was also a large discussion when it came to the IT department and how much was being invested upfront, and whether it should be contractors or city staff who fill the new positions.
Councilor Denton? Assistant Mayor?
Myself, Councilor Cook, Blaylock, and our finance heads, we were at Community Campus. Unfortunately, we had no residents, but we did kind of spend some time discussing maybe next year to add a Zoom online option so that we can allow residents to participate from home to try to make it so there is not a zero-sum game.
Thanks, Assistant Mayor. Councilor Moreau?
Councilor Tabor, myself, and the city manager were at the middle school from the 5:30 to 6:30 timeframe. I'd say we approximately had maybe 10 residents that were there, and we had quite a long discussion. First were some questions around more detail and explanation in our budget regarding other operating, because the general budget, it's actually like $5 million, and there was at least $2 million. So they're having those details. There is a section, and we were able to point that out, but they asked to really get some more detail around big line items that just sort of say other. We were also asked to decrease the budget by 2% because they don't feel that the increases that we have are sustainable for our community. So lowering the tax rate was, or keeping the tax rate the same, was a big conversation. That there was talk around increasing city staffing and how that is a tax burden on our residents. They also are looking for us to be able to find a way to show commercial properties that how they pay their fair share as far as being taxpayers and ratepayers in some cases. And there was some talk about how some communities have done scorecards showing development costs to city versus revenue to city, and actually scoring development projects. And then there was other discussion around the public asking for taxpayer money to be shown to be efficiently being spent, so that they know that their tax dollars are being spent efficiently and not wastefully. There was also request discussions around talks with the residents earlier in the budget process, because they feel like that by the time we actually sit down and talk to them is when we're getting ready to sort of come around to try to finalize the budget. They'd like to have discussions much earlier in the process around what their ideas and thoughts around the budget are. They also asked to have more statistics, so request that statistics are used to actually show reasons for increasing the budget and what the statistics and what that covers. And ask residents what services they can do without. I mean, there was a lot of people that say they want to lower the budget, and we said maybe those are some of the conversations that you could have with the public, and maybe flash vote early on in the process is, if you don't want to see the budget go up, or if you don't want the tax rate to change, what might you be willing to do without, right? So those are kind of some of the conversations that we had around, unless Councilor Tabor has anything to add to that.
No, that was a good recap. And I think it was your head count was 10, and I think that's what we had.
All right. Next up, unless there are other questions that the council had before we get to public dialogue. I know we've been going for 3 hours now, but other questions before we hear from the public? Just for folks at home, the first opportunity that we will have to pass the budget will be a week from next week, correct?
Correct.
I'm doing that. We don't have a council meeting next week?
Correct.
Correct. Nailed it. So we'll have 2 weeks from tonight. Again, amendments can be made at that on that evening. We would love it if they are going to be made before, so that Andrew's head doesn't start, smoking in the back because he's trying to do the math. But why don't we hear from the public? And again, it's an unlimited amount of time, but would just ask for Portsmouth residents, business owners, and students to go first. Just state your name, city of residents. Try to keep 3 minutes in your heart.
Mike's open. No one wants to speak.
Good evening, Council, City Manager. My name is Peter Whale, and I live at 100 Gate Street. I'm just going to remind you, you've been in office for 2 years. The budget's gone up $19 million. You've added 30 employees over 2 years. Each one of those employees is going to have benefits and retirement and everything else. That's a lot. I mean, this city's 21,000 people. We haven't been growing by 10% a year. You've really got to look at this budget. It's not sustainable. Next year, we're going to have a big problem because the ESSER funds are going to run out. I don't have an issue with the police and fire at all. Like, we have two great departments here. They're very fiscally responsible. But other parts of the city are adding people that we don't need. And you really have to ask yourselves, do we need 30 additional people in the city to do things? And I maintain we don't. So it's going to become a burden on the taxpayers. We're looking at our taxes going up again next year. I know June 1st, I've got to pay my taxes, and it's going to be unsustainable. Each one of you has pledged to do more for affordable housing and keeping Portsmouth affordable. We're on an unsustainable track right now. You're using fund balance to pay for operating costs. It's not good. That's using our rainy day fund. And I don't have a crystal ball, but we may be headed toward a little recession here in the next 2 years, and what are we going to do? We're going to have to lay people off. So I really would encourage each one of you to look at every position that's being added. Do we really need that person? And there's no games and tricks here. I mean, you can say, oh, we're going to add them in the middle of the year. It's still a person that's going to be full-time employee here at the city that we're responsible for benefits, retirement, and the burden is going to continue. So I'd urge each one of you to really, I haven't heard a lot tonight. I'm kind of surprised from each one of you how you're going to really represent the residents here. 9 of you are the ones who are responsible to the residents and the taxes and the tax rate. I'd encourage you to really sharpen your pencils and do the best job you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Esther Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave. The other night at the public dialogue session, I'm a little dismayed Mr. Denton didn't bring this up. We had one of our city residents there who kept saying, what would Julia do? And asked you to start thinking about residents in particular that have been here a long time. In some cases, living in great-grandparents' home. And I ask you to do that. I have never seen a budget in 2 years go up so much. I have never seen a budget in 2 years add so many employees. When I counted, looking at your report, it was like it was 36 employees. The paper said that you have 110 people over $100,000. We have 22,000 people in our community. I'm a landlord in another community in New Hampshire. And whenever the budget goes up and my taxes go up, I raise the rent. I don't have a choice. So a lot of you ran on the fact that you were going to make this affordable for all. And whenever you raise the budget, you have set it back, because landlords in this community will raise their rents. And even, I know some people are doing it because the rents are going sky high and they can go for the money. But those good old-fashioned people that have units that they've had forever are going to have to raise it even if they want to see a place that's affordable to all. And it's because of you folks. I asked you the other night in my budget committees, and I asked all the people sitting here, that you look at every position and you say to yourselves, do we need that position when those people leave or retire? That's when you really look and say, what is our community? You do not want to be laying people off in a year when your ESSER funds run out. Or if there's a downturn in the budget. You do not want to be there. No one wants to be there. You look at your budget and you look at your people and you look at your needs and you say, that position is going to cost me this much in health insurance, in retirement. And that's when you make your decision. Councilor Bagley, I'm glad you're okay with the budget. I'm glad you're okay with everything. However, I don't think a lot of people are, because they are trying to figure out how they can afford to keep their houses here in Portsmouth or live in Portsmouth as a single person trying to work and live in the same community. And they can't do it. And you've all heard the same stuff I've heard. So I ask you tonight to take a harder look, dig deep, and look at the positions of those people that have left. I didn't even hear anyone ask the question of who's left and has that been done. You can decide whether you want to cut different parts of the budget. As a counselor, sometimes I've been asked to do that, or give a bottom line figure. As a counselor, you get to choose that. But what I was hoping to hear is that I would hear from some counselors that you are willing to make a cut to save those people and look at housing and save those people that are on fixed incomes. And I guess what I heard the other night at the budget meeting I sat in was, what would Julia do? And I ask you to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
H. Trace, 27 Hancock Street. Much like the past two speakers, I really find myself struggling because you've worked very hard on the budget. But they are correct. You're going to add 30 to 35, 36 new employees. So I wonder if, as Councilor Tabor so eloquently said earlier, it's about wants versus needs. It's about maintaining that AAA budget that happened under the past city manager. And when you're looking at wants versus needs and affordable housing, let's look at old Portsmouth. Let's look at those people who have been here more than 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, and let's look at whether they can afford to stay. They created Portsmouth. They created what you enjoy today and what you are the keepers of. So when it comes to wants versus needs, clean water, sewer, we've got a pumping station. The main pumping station in this city is still waiting for 2 pumps to come back. It still is exposed up and outside the ground level. And where are they? And where is the new pumping station? about 5 or 6 years ago, that new pumping station was going to be a whole whopping $8 million. I'm going to guess that if you asked Mr. Rice today, it's not going to be $8 million. So let's look at what we need. Let's look at what the city needs. Let's look at what Old Portsmouth needs. And that's not a budget that's going to put them out of their own homes and into another city. Be the stewards, be the people that are worried about everyone, just not New Portsmouth, but Old Portsmouth as well, and those residents who helped to put you where you are today. And I too agree that police and fire need to be left alone. Fire comes before you every year with a legitimate group of wants and needs. But their wants are what they need. And the same thing with police. And I do agree with Assistant Mayor Kelly that there needs to be someone who is a mental health officer within the police department. But don't take a 5th officer away at the expense of giving the mental health officer. Give them all what they need, not what they want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paige.
Mark Brighton, South Mill Street. $17.2 million 2-year proposed budget increase, 36 new positions, and now apparently there's 110 people earning over $100,000. Am I the only one that sees the absurd irony in all of this? Because apparently there is a supermajority of you, and for this numerically challenged council, that would be 6, that can't even count to 5, let alone 132 million. So, yeah. This is now the most unethical council I have ever run into, and that is saying something, because I've been at this now for 23 years, ever since 9/11, when I realized that, you know, bad things happen when good people stand by and do nothing. But the only person that is not acting unethically apparently is Beth Moreau at this point. But there's still plenty of time, Beth. Maybe you can do it too. So, City Attorney Morell, you have a hell of a mess here, but don't worry, it is simply a short sprint to a very padded retirement.
Thank you, Mark. Any other speakers?
We have a hand on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
Good evening, Peter Huda, 280 South Street. First of all, I'd like to ask, it would have been really nice if the rest of us got the questions in the packet prior to the meeting. City Manager. So the first thing I want to reiterate here is, after doing a little research, and this is for a shout out to the rest of Portsmouth, did you know this is the largest 2-year budget increase in the history of Portsmouth? $8 million last year. The request this year is for $9 million, not counting your 4.4.
Peter, just, sorry to interrupt, just these numbers, our first year on the council, we raised it $476,000. Our second year on the council, we raised it for $7,309,000. Last year, it was $505 million, or $6 million, this year, it's proposed as 4.8. I don't know where these numbers that you're getting. These are the actual numbers that we have over the last 4 years. First year we were on the council together, 476K. The next year was the highest increase that we had at $7.3 million. Last year, $6 million. This year, it's proposed at $4.8 million. Just want to get those numbers out there. Those are the actual budget numbers.
Thank you, Mayor. I thought this was public comment. So last year, if you look at the numbers in the front of the book, that's what it says. You asked for 10 million, you got 8. I can recite the numbers off in the book. So I don't know where you're getting your numbers, but I'm getting my numbers out of the stuff that the staff produces. I have no other source. Why would I make it up? And I'll go on. Next, I'd like to address the $653,000 that Judy addressed. So I am the one that asked how this would go into the 3 unions. So on page 4, basically it says 3% COLA for the 10 unsettled collective bargaining agreements. The reason I asked this is because Councilor Lombardi on Monday the 15th said it looked great. It doesn't look great because the whole story is not in there. I can do the math and take 3% of each one of these and figure it out. But my question was for the information of the council. Next, I'd like to address the fact that Mayor asked me at the end of the meeting last Thursday if I could do a summary on what the questions were. Somebody in the Portsmouth Pulse did that for us. Hopefully you're reading that. There's 4 chapters in there, and it tells you exactly what was summarized out of each one of the meetings. Please reference that. Next thing I'd like to ask is, we're all talking about climate change. We're focused on climate change everywhere else but in the budget. We have a $650,000 total for snow removal again. There's $50,000 in community campus, there's $300,000 in parking, and there's $297,794 in the snow removal budget, $100,000 of which is overtime. I would like this council to look at that based on climate change and what has been happening there. I guess the last thing that I'm going to touch on here is the question I had asked on the combination of the City Manager Department and the Department of Economic Development. When you split a department out with one person, you add all the supplemental fees in there. The title of that department head is Assistant City Manager for Economic Development. I would ask you, combine, save the taxpayers some money. I asked you that last time. It doesn't seem to be on your list. The other things I have aren't really questions. They're answers that were not answered previously. Assistant Mayor Kelly asked about why the recycling was so low. The reason the recycling is getting a boost is because there's a transfer that's coming out of the parking department of $100,000. That's why it went down, Assistant Mayor. There's also transfers coming out of the so-called reserves of parking for Prescott Park, recycling, and there's a third one that I won't mention. You really need to look at how much of your reserves you're starting to take. Yes, our parking revenue is going back up because we basically under budgeted again. I'm not going to get into that. I discussed that for 3 straight years and nothing was done. The point of that is, Councilor Tabor, if your revenue is going up but you're still transferring $2.5 million to the general fund, that leaves Mr. Fletcher with less money to use in his operations, especially when you're moving out funds for other departments. Think about that. Again, you can say you're up 400,000 all you want, Mr. Mayor. The reports tell a different story. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. One hand on Zoom. Former Mayor Rick Beckstead. Can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Floor is yours.
Okay. So, Mayor, I just wanted to go and point out I'm holding in my hand the CAFA report that we received, and I have a copy of it when I attended the meeting. And basically, the CAFA report does show that it was literally $10 million that did go up last year. What we did was we supplemented last year to go and offset with ARPA fund money. And we're doing the same thing this year. You've got a proposed budget of $4-some odd million, and you're subsidizing $4.4 million. That's why everybody that's coming up and speaking and the numbers that are hearing, you're hearing 9.2 million, because that's exactly what is happening in the budget. It's going up this year, 9.2, and we're supplementing. I guess my question is, are we going to be supplementing every year that 4.4, just like we do the $4.5 million from the parking garage to offset revenue for the costs of the taxpayer? We're not. The money's not going to be there. The revenue is going down. We knew this was going to happen. Councilor Tabor and Mayor McEachran, you know as well as the rest of us do, that we went and stayed as conservative as we could for those 2 years during that pandemic. And it was to get through the pandemic. But the more worries were after the pandemic. And under this council and under this management, we have gone to the largest increase in the budget over a 2-year period. Plain and simple. And we shouldn't be doing it, because now they're talking about a real recession, things slowing down considerably. We should not be adding. And when we're supplementing, I will give Judy and the city manager credit, because I sat for 2 years as mayor asking if we could use, and I loved the fact that the city manager used in her first meeting during the presentation that we have a surplus, because that word doesn't happen, to go and offset. And Judy told me both times that I sat and met with her that we could not use it. It wasn't something that was done that way. And that was done under city manager John Bohinko, that didn't like to use that. So at least we've broken away and been able to go and do that. But we cannot survive by going and supplementing every single time or a half year. You got to catch up. This council has not asked the questions they did last year. Councilor Monroe had gone and asked, by us using the ARPA fund money and creating these positions, what would it go into the budget? You're automatically building in from last year into this year, and you're doing the 4.4 this year, and you're putting into next year. Let us all not forget that under the New Hampshire state law, under Mayor Sorrell, with the law that was created, we have no choice but to actually do a complete reevaluation. Last year, the numbers were Portsmouth were somewhere around 70%, when we are required by New Hampshire state law at 87 to 110%. And I think that we're probably not even in that 70 percentile. We might actually be less than that. I am scared to death, and everyone in Portsmouth should be scared to death, that a 30% plus increase in your value of your homes is going to go up when we do a full evaluation next year. This is scary times. This is a scary place. I have lived in this city now for 40 years, and I have never seen anything like this before. In the 40 years of my lifetime, listening to my parents and their friends and all of the people that helped Portsmouth make, I guess, what it is today to the most part. But you've got to stop this spending. We have a serious spending problem. We can't keep adding to it. You heard from the police department that there are 5 positions that weren't filled. You added 2 from last year and to try and make up, and we can't go and get it. And even if we get it, it's going to be another year we built into it. Cut back. Be responsible. Do the right thing for the taxpayers. We cannot keep affording to do this. I wish you all a good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. Any other speakers here? Seeing none, want to thank everyone for coming this evening. And again, the numbers are numbers. It's not.
when we look back over the 4 years, it's difficult. Things like skate parks, which the groundbreaking is going to be on Thursday. That was a supplemental appropriation to our budget in 2020, or 2020. So that's why, 2022, that's why the largest increase that we had in my last 4 years was it was my second year on the council. That's why we had a $7 million budget, is because we appropriated a skate park. I'm not saying that that's not something that's going to be good, but the choices that we make here tonight, and to Councilor Tabor's point, I think echoed by Councilor Bagley in terms of collective bargaining, understanding that the fund balance, is there. It's a tool, but should be cognizant of what that tool can be used for. Is a part of the total budget that everything is going to be going towards. So again, 2 more weeks before we have the first chance to pass the budget. Appreciate everybody that's come out and spoken so far. I know that a number have reached out asking, and would love to sit down with each and every one of you that has, not in the council, but obviously outside, to have a conversation, because this budget is our values, and that's how we discuss the future. So look forward to that conversation, and thank you all for coming out.